In gilded palaces and candlelit courts, beauty was never just vanity, it was survival. From deadly powders to bizarre midnight rituals, royals risked their health and sanity in the relentless pursuit of perfection. But behind the elegance lay secrets so disturbing they make today's beauty fads seem tame. In this video, we'll uncover 33 shocking health and beauty practices once embraced by kings, queens, and emperors. Some were strange, some dangerous, and some downright deadly. Ready to step into a world where glamour and horror walked hand in hand? Let's begin. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more strange stories from history's darkest corners. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now as you uncover these royal secrets with us. 1. Venetian carouse, lead makeup. In the shimmering world of the Elizabethan and Stuart courts, beauty was not just vanity, it was power. For noble women especially, the face was a canvas upon which rank, refinement, and desirability were painted. And nothing symbolized aristocratic allure more than a skin as white and flawless as porcelain. The chosen tool for achieving this ideal was Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic concoction made of white lead mixed with vinegar. It created a mask-like smoothness, erasing blemishes and lending an artificial glow that suggested purity and privilege. To appear with a tanned or ruddy complexion risked association with the working classes who laboured outdoors. Thus, the ghostly pallor offered by ceruse became a mark of distinction, but at a terrible price. The practice was not limited to anonymous courtiers. Queen Elizabeth I herself was famously associated with ceruse, especially after smallpox scars marred her natural complexion. Painted portraits immortalize her pale, almost otherworldly visage, one that contemporaries described as regal but increasingly unnatural. The Queen's example cemented the fashion across her court. Ladies of status, eager to imitate her, layered their faces with the toxic paste, even as whispers grew about the damage it caused. Behind the ivory mask lurked ulcerated flesh, prematurely aged skin, and often irreversible disfigurement. Medical voices of the time were not silent. Physicians and moralists alike warned that lead was not merely a cosmetic risk, but a poison seeping into the very bloodstream. Satirical pamphlets mocked women for clinging to a beauty regimen that, while lending a temporary glamour, corroded their features beneath. One biting critique compared carouse users to painted statues, lifeless and cold, whose pursuit of beauty made them grotesque. Others noted how the paste cracked under expressions of laughter or anger, leaving its wearers with a brittle, doll-like visage. Yet the warnings were rarely heeded, because the stakes of beauty in courtly life were simply too high. Part of ceruse's disturbing appeal lay in its paradox. The very substance that created the illusion of vitality and youth was actively destroying the skin. Court rumors circulated of ladies whose flesh beneath the paint grew so damaged that they could not appear in public without fresh layers of the very poison that worsened their condition. This vicious cycle of damage hidden by further application trapped noble women in dependency. For them, abandoning ceruse would have meant revealing a ruined face, a prospect as socially ruinous as the cosmetic itself was physically ruinous. The cultural weight of pale skin only deepened the problem. Whiteness was linked not only to class, but also to ideals of femininity and morality. A smooth, pallid face suggested chastity, delicacy, and high birth. To forego the look risked exclusion from the subtle but ruthless competitions of courtly display. In the battle between health and social survival, health almost always lost. Venetian ceruse, though deadly, became a weapon of ambition, wielded willingly by women who understood the risks but saw no alternative if they wished to secure marriage alliances, political favor, or the Queen's approval. Historians now point out how the popularity of carouse also reflected broader anxieties of the age. The Elizabethan court was rife with uncertainty, political intrigue, religious conflict, and the looming question of succession. Against such a backdrop, cultivating a mask of beauty was more than vanity. It was a form of armor. The flawless white face projected control and serenity even when the body beneath was weakened by the very makeup that sustained the illusion. In a sense, Venetian ceruse turned its wearers into living symbols of contradiction, radiant on the surface, suffering underneath. The practice persisted into the Stuart courts, long after physicians had declared its dangers. The resilience of the fad underscores how deeply beauty standards can override reason. Even when cases of lead poisoning became obvious, symptoms such as hair loss, tooth decay, and trembling, women clung to the ritual. Some historians argue that this adherence bordered on self-destruction, though in truth it was more a reflection of the unforgiving pressures placed upon noble women. To appear without ceruse was not a neutral act. It risked being labelled unfashionable, unfeminine, or even unworthy of courtly circles. What makes Venetian carouse so disturbing today is not only the toxic ingredient, but also the psychological hold it exerted. It demonstrates how beauty ideals, when linked to status and survival, can drive people into practices they know to be harmful. In the case of ceruse, the makeup became both a mask and a trap, a shining symbol of power that quietly consumed those who wore it. The alabaster glow it promised was, in truth, a slow death disguised as glamour. And while Venetian carouse may have faded from cosmetic tables, its legacy lingers as a cautionary tale about the price of appearance. The courtly obsession with whiteness and control over the body would find echoes in other equally dangerous fads. One of the most shocking came from the Italian Renaissance, where noble women willingly risked their eyesight and sometimes their lives, all for the sake of a seductive gaze. 2. Belladonna eye drops. If Venetian carouse gave the face its porcelain sheen, the Renaissance courts of Italy added yet another disturbing flourish. Eyes so wide and dark, they appeared perpetually entranced. To achieve this effect, noble women turned to an extract from the deadly nightshade plant, known as belladonna. The name itself, beautiful woman, suggests its intimate tie to ideals of allure. A few drops into the eyes caused the pupils to dilate dramatically, lending the gaze a sultry, liquid quality that poets compared to stars and artists immortalized on canvas. But the cost of this beauty was perilous, for belladonna was as toxic as it was beguiling. The practice flourished particularly in Venice and Florence, where appearance was not just personal but political. At court gatherings, masquerades, and diplomatic encounters, a penetrating gaze could make as much impact as eloquent speech. A woman whose eyes shimmered with unnatural darkness seemed to radiate mystery and power. Men praised it as mesmerizing. Women envied it and followed suit. Apothecaries, well aware of the demand, bottled solutions of diluted nightshade leaves for their wealthy clientele, even as physicians issued stern warnings. The irony was stark. A substance renowned for its lethal qualities in poisons and assassinations was being repurposed as an instrument of glamour. The effects of belladonna were immediate and, at first, intoxicating. The dilated pupils softened the iris, making eyes appear larger and more luminous. In dim candlelight, the effect could be breathtaking, a living embodiment of Renaissance ideals of beauty and passion. Yet alongside the temporary appeal came a cascade of troubling side effects. Vision blurred, making it difficult to read, sew, or even walk safely. Light sensitivity grew unbearable, so much so that many noble women shied away from sunlight, retreating to shaded chambers and candlelit halls. Some accounts describe headaches, dizziness, and heart palpitations, symptoms that contemporaries began to associate with the drops. Still, the allure of captivating eyes proved stronger than fear of faintness or discomfort. Doctors of the era railed against the practice, describing it as a slow march toward blindness. Anatomists recognized that belladonna disrupted the eye's natural ability to focus, straining muscles and damaging sight permanently. Warnings circulated in medical texts and sermons alike, often couched in moralistic language. Beauty pursued through such dangerous means was vanity courting destruction. Satirists, too, found rich material in the image of women stumbling through court, unable to see clearly, all in service of appearing more beautiful. And yet, just as with Carus, mockery and medical warnings did little to dim the popularity of the fad. The persistence of belladonna eye drops speaks to the extraordinary pressures noble women faced in Renaissance courts. To maintain influence, secure advantageous marriages, or simply remain the center of attention, one had to project an image of unattainable allure. Eyes, the so-called windows of the soul, became battlegrounds in this struggle for recognition. A noble woman who failed to dazzle risked fading into obscurity, while one who embraced the fad, however hazardous, might secure admiration and power. The drops thus became more than a cosmetic. They were a tool of social survival. Over time, however, the darker consequences could not be ignored. Accounts survive of women losing much of their sight, forced into lives of semi-blindness because of years of repeated dosing. Some may have even succumbed to systemic poisoning, for the alkaloids of deadly nightshade did not confine themselves to the eyes. They travelled through mucous membranes, affecting nerves, disrupting the heartbeat, and, in higher doses, potentially ending lives. The very beauty-enhancing substance celebrated in Venetian salons also occupied the shelves of apothecaries' poison drawers, a reminder of its double-edged nature. What is most disturbing is not simply that women used belladonna knowingly, but that the courts around them encouraged and rewarded it. Painters flattered their patrons by depicting wide, dark eyes, ensuring the fad spread further. Poets sang of gazes that could enslave hearts. Courtiers whispered about the irresistible allure of women whose eyes gleamed unnaturally in candlelight. In such a climate, the line between genuine admiration and dangerous compulsion blurred, just as the vision of the wearers themselves blurred under the drug's influence. Today, belladonna serves as a chilling case study of how cultural ideals can warp personal choice. In an age that prized mystery and passion above reason, women risked their health, their eyesight, and even their longevity for the fleeting power of a gaze. The story forces us to consider how much agency they truly had. Were they vain, reckless experimenters, or victims of a system that judged them almost entirely by their appearance? Perhaps they were both, caught between desire and demand, beauty and danger. As the Renaissance gave way to later centuries, the fascination with belladonna did not vanish completely. Elements of the practice resurfaced in subtle forms, with later cosmetic traditions still valuing the appearance of dark, wide eyes. But its most notorious heyday remains tied to the Italian courts, where the drop of a poison could elevate a woman to the pinnacle of fashion, even as it dimmed her vision forever. And if the eyes were not enough, the quest for pallor and fragility soon reached even further extremes. By the 19th century, European aristocrats would go so far as to ingest poisons, not just for a gaze or a complexion, but for the very aura of delicacy itself, turning arsenic into a disturbing staple of beauty. If you're enjoying these hidden truths from royal history, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that peel back the polished surface of the past. And I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it right now as you journey with us through these disturbing royal fads? 3. Arsenic complexion wafers. In the 19th century, Europe witnessed a peculiar collision of science, fashion, and peril. As industrialization transformed society and medicine advanced in uneven strides, aristocrats and social climbers alike sought new ways to embody ideals of beauty. Among the most shocking of these practices was the ingestion of arsenic in the form of so-called complexion wafers. These small, candy-like tablets promised a pale, smooth skin tone, free of blemishes and suffused with an ethereal glow. Advertisements hailed them as modern marvels, and women of high society whispered about their miraculous effects at salons and soirees. Yet behind the polished branding lay a truth already recognized by chemists of the time. Arsenic was poison, a slow and insidious killer. The obsession with pallor had deep cultural roots. Fair skin signified refinement, privilege, and distance from outdoor labor. In portraits and novels, heroines were praised for their delicate, almost translucent complexions. For noble families and the wealthy bourgeoisie, looking fragile was a badge of status. Against this backdrop, arsenic wafers found a receptive audience. Manufacturers capitalized on the demand, packaging them attractively and selling them through apothecaries or even discreet mail order. Women, and sometimes men, consumed them in small doses, believing they would purify the blood and lighten the skin from within. The effects, at least initially, appeared convincing. Users reported a faint rosy flush beneath a pale surface, a look that seemed to signal both vitality and refinement. The promise of permanent youthfulness echoed through marketing slogans, making the wafers especially appealing in a society where beauty was closely tied to social advancement. For young women entering marriage markets and seasoned hostesses hoping to retain influence, the wafers seemed like a secret weapon. But the short-term benefits masked long-term devastation. Chemists, toxicologists, and even satirical writers condemned the fad. Arsenic's dangers were well known. It was the same substance used in rat poison and infamous for its role in countless murders. Physicians noted that habitual wafer users often complained of digestive problems, tingling in the limbs, hair loss, or a constant sense of fatigue. More advanced cases included discolored fingernails, skin eruptions, and, ironically, the very blemishes the wafers claimed to erase. Some women grew so dependent on the routine that they ignored these warning signs, convinced that the wafers were the key to their beauty. What made the practice particularly disturbing was its veneer of legitimacy. Unlike raw lead paste or belladonna drops, arsenic wafers were marketed as part of a new scientific era of health. Advertisements implied they were carefully measured, almost medicinal, and sometimes even bore endorsements from figures claiming medical expertise. This blurring of the line between cosmetic and pharmaceutical misled consumers into believing the wafers were safe if used responsibly. In reality, arsenic accumulates in the body, meaning that even small doses taken regularly could cause permanent damage. The social pressures driving the fad were immense. In a competitive world of balls, theatre outings, and political dinners, looking flawless could mean the difference between inclusion and exclusion. Women judged one another as much as men judged them, and the faint suggestion that someone had discovered a secret to everlasting youth fueled envy and imitation. The arsenic wafer, though whispered about with a mixture of fascination and unease, became a symbol of daring modernity. Those who consumed them positioned themselves as fashionable risk-takers, willing to embrace the cutting edge of science for beauty's sake. Satirists and moralists seized upon this contradiction. Newspaper cartoons lampooned ladies nibbling poison sweets, while chemists looked on in horror. Pamphlets warned that society was willingly poisoning itself for vanity. Yet ridicule had little power against the desire for social dominance. Even when physicians published case studies of arsenic's damage, the wafers continued to sell. They represented a deeper truth about beauty standards. When appearance is equated with worth, people will risk almost anything to meet the ideal. The legacy of arsenic wafers remains unsettling. They illustrate how commerce can exploit cultural anxieties, wrapping poison in the language of progress. They also reveal the fragility of the individuals caught within these pressures. Many women who consumed the wafers may have known, at least dimly, that they were unsafe, but the alternative, aging visibly, showing blemishes, or losing social ground, seemed worse. The slow destruction of their bodies was hidden beneath layers of silk gowns and candlelight, masked until it was too late. This chilling fad reminds us that beauty, in many eras, was not just a matter of cosmetics, but of survival in unforgiving social hierarchies. Arsenic wafers, like ceruse and belladonna before them, revealed the extraordinary lengths to which royals and aristocrats were willing to go in pursuit of an ideal that demanded frailty, purity, and control. And disturbingly, the path of ingesting poisons for the sake of beauty did not end here. For in imperial courts, some rulers went even further, adopting grotesque nightly rituals that involved not swallowing powders, but smothering the face itself in raw flesh, an eerie practice that would come to define the strange beauty regimen of Empress Elizabeth of Austria. 4. Raw veal face masks, among the most haunting beauty rituals ever documented in royal history, belongs to Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi. Revered across Europe for her elegance and striking appearance, Sisi cultivated an image of delicate perfection that became both her shield and her burden. Obsessed with maintaining her youthful skin and slim figure, she experimented with diets, exercise regimens, and cosmetics that often shocked even her contemporaries. Of all her eccentric habits, the most infamous was her practice of sleeping with raw veal pressed against her face, an attempt to preserve tightness and radiance in her skin. The notion of meat as medicine was not entirely alien to the 19th century. Folk remedies across Europe occasionally employed animal products as poultices for wounds or inflammation. Yet Sisi's nightly masks pushed this tradition into the realm of disturbing vanity. Court attendants recorded how she would retire to bed with strips of raw veal applied beneath gauze or cloth wrappings, believing the animal flesh transferred vitality into her own. It was a ritual at once macabre and intimate, and it earned her both fascination and ridicule. For Sisi, appearance was inseparable from identity. Her beauty was not just admired, it was politicized. As Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary, she lived in the constant glare of scrutiny. Portraitists idealized her image, and poets described her as the embodiment of romantic femininity. Yet beneath this praise lay a relentless anxiety. To remain beloved, she had to remain beautiful. Sisi herself confessed in her diaries that she feared aging more than almost anything. The raw veal mask was her desperate attempt to outpace time. Contemporary physicians were not impressed. They cautioned that sleeping with raw meat against the skin risked bacterial infection, irritation, and foul odors. Some court gossip suggested her attendants dreaded the ritual, finding it both unsanitary and unsettling. Critics mocked the Empress for indulging in such grotesque measures, dubbing her beauty practices excessive even by the standards of a vanity-obsessed aristocracy. Yet her determination to pursue the habit night after night reveals how deeply she internalized the era's unforgiving standards of appearance. Sisi's veal masks also highlight the strange interplay between science and superstition in the 19th century. Though germ theory was beginning to take root, many still clung to older beliefs that substances could transfer vitality by direct contact. If raw meat represented energy, strength, or youth, perhaps it could feed the skin as well. Sisi, always searching for new regimens, embraced the theory wholeheartedly. To her, the mask was not bizarre but logical, a nightly treatment in her ongoing battle with age. The wider significance of Sisi's ritual lies in how it mirrored her personal struggles. Behind her glittering position, she endured profound loneliness, political constraints, and depression. Her obsessive beauty practices became coping mechanisms, a way to exert control over at least one aspect of her life. The raw veal mask, though strange to us today, symbolized her refusal to surrender to time and circumstance. To the Empress, each night's ritual was a small act of defiance, a promise that she could still command admiration when so much else was beyond her power. Of course, history has judged the practice harshly. Modern readers recoil at the thought of raw flesh pressed against delicate skin, yet perhaps the most unsettling aspect is not the veal itself, but the desperation it represents. Cece's nightly masks remind us of the crushing expectations placed upon royal women, expectations so heavy that even dangerous or absurd measures seemed reasonable. To fail in beauty meant to fail in influence, and failure was not an option for an empress. The legend of Cece's raw veal masks has endured precisely because it dramatizes the lengths to which she, and by extension many royals, were willing to go in their quest for eternal youth. It stands as a grotesque symbol of vanity turned into ritual, of desperation masquerading as discipline. The Empress may have hoped to preserve her beauty in silence, but instead she left behind one of the most notorious anecdotes of royal self-care in history. And Cece was hardly alone. Other courts, too, embraced equally hazardous regimens in their pursuit of beauty. In the late medieval and early Tudor world, noble women turned not to veal, but to caustic chemicals, using harsh substances to reshape their very hairlines. The next fad reveals how the pursuit of fashion could literally burn away parts of the body in the name of elegance. 5. Hairline erasure with caustics. In the late medieval period and into the Tudor age, beauty was a matter not just of complexion, but of geometry. The ideal female face, especially at court, was imagined as broad and high, with a smooth, open forehead that symbolized intelligence and refinement. To achieve this look, noble women often turned to a practice that now seems both disturbing and cruel: the deliberate erasure of their natural hairlines using caustic substances such as quicklime, vinegar, or harsh alkalis. By chemically burning away the roots of the hair at the top of the forehead, they could raise the hairline several inches, producing the elongated brow that painters of the time immortalized in portraits. The fashion was not confined to one court, but appeared across Europe, from Burgundy to England. Yet the Tudors, with their flair for theatrical display, made it especially prominent. The paintings of Henry VIII's wives and court ladies often show them with vast expanses of forehead, gleaming pale beneath elaborate headdresses. To modern eyes, the effect can seem alien, even unnatural. To their contemporaries, however, it was the height of elegance. A high forehead suggested nobility, grace, and sophistication, qualities every ambitious courtier sought to embody. Achieving this ideal required painful measures. Manuals and household recipes of the period describe concoctions of lime, walnut oil, vinegar, and sometimes even arsenic mixed into pastes. These were applied along the hairline, left to sting and burn until the follicles gave way, and then scraped or washed off. The results were uneven at best. Some women ended up with reddened, blistered skin or patchy regrowth that only accentuated the damage. Physicians of the era warned that such treatments could scar the skin permanently, while moralists decried them as evidence of vanity run wild. Yet the pursuit of the monstrous forehead, as some critics called it, continued for generations. The practice was not without its ironies. While women endured the pain and danger of caustics to heighten their brows, poets often celebrated natural beauty in verse, praising women whose faces seemed effortless and untouched. But in courtly reality, natural was rarely enough. The competition for attention, marriage alliances, and favor at court drove noble women into regimens that were anything but natural. Just as Venetian chorus trapped women in a cycle of poisoning, hairline erasure locked them into a cycle of burning and regrowth. To stop the treatments was to allow one's hairline to creep back down, signaling neglect or loss of status. The disturbing quality of this fad lies not only in its physical toll, but also in the social meaning attached to it. A woman's forehead became a canvas upon which her rank was displayed. To appear with a low hairline was to risk being judged as rustic, common, or unfashionable. Thus, women willingly risked burns and scars to fit the aesthetic mold. In a society where female power was often limited to appearance and influence, controlling the very shape of one's face became a matter of survival. Artists played a powerful role in reinforcing the trend. Portraits of noble women, idealized by court painters, enshrined the high forehead as a marker of beauty. These images circulated beyond the court, spreading the ideal to wider audiences. What the portraits concealed, of course, were the chemical burns, scabs, and discomfort suffered to achieve the look. The polished surface of art masked the painful truth of practice. From a modern perspective, hairline erasure seems almost unimaginable. Yet when placed alongside other courtly beauty fads, arsenic wafers, belladonna drops, or Cece's raw veal masks, it fits into a broader pattern, the relentless pursuit of an ideal, no matter the cost. The forehead, like the complexion or the gaze, became a battleground where vanity, social ambition, and physical harm intertwined. This obsession with reshaping the body by unnatural means would evolve in later centuries into ever stranger fashions. If noble women of the Tudor era were willing to burn away their own hair for elegance, the Georgian age would take vanity to a new level of peculiarity, replacing lost eyebrows not with caustics, but with the fur of tiny creatures, a fad as macabre as it was absurd. 6. Mouse fur eyebrows. In the glittering yet sometimes grotesque world of 18th century Georgian fashion, nothing was left to chance when it came to presentation. Hair, wigs, cosmetics, and clothing all conspired to create an aura of refinement and luxury. Yet one feature often betrayed the toll of these excesses: the eyebrows. The widespread use of lead-based cosmetics, such as Venetian ceruse and powdered wigs, had devastating side effects, including hair loss. Many aristocratic women, and even some men, discovered that their once expressive brows had thinned or vanished altogether. Rather than accept this loss, they turned to a solution that seems almost surreal today: eyebrows made from tiny strips of mouse fur. The idea sounds outlandish, but for Georgian courtiers it was a practical answer to a social dilemma. In an era when facial expression and subtle gestures carried enormous significance, eyebrows were considered crucial to elegance and communication. To appear at court without brows risked ridicule and loss of allure. The mouse fur eyebrow, carefully trimmed and glued into place, restored symmetry to the face and projected an image of youthful vitality. Though macabre in source, these furry prosthetics became fashionable enough that satirists, artists, and pamphleteers could not resist lampooning them. Contemporary caricatures often depicted fashionable ladies with exaggerated patches of fur perched above their eyes, mocking their desperation to maintain appearances. Pamphlets poked fun at the absurdity of using a rodent's hide to signal sophistication, calling it a symbol of vanity gone awry. Yet much like other beauty fads, mockery did little to dampen the practice. Those who wore mouse fur brows did so with seriousness, believing the disguise essential to their courtly persona. The process itself was delicate. Small sections of mouse skin were shaved, dried, and shaped into narrow arcs. These were then attached with adhesive, sometimes a kind of gum arabic or spirit-based glue, directly onto the forehead. The look, when applied skillfully, could be surprisingly convincing under candlelight and layers of powder. However, the fragility of the attachment created constant anxiety. At banquets, dances, or theatrical outings, there was always the risk of perspiration loosening the glue, leaving an eyebrow to slip at an inopportune moment. Anecdotes circulated of ladies discreetly retreating to refix a brow, or worse, of a furry strip falling onto a plate mid-supper. Physicians and moralists criticized the fad, not only for its vanity, but also for its potential hygiene risks. The preparation of mouse skins was unlikely to be sterile, and placing them near the eyes raised the possibility of irritation or infection. Still, the fear of appearing incomplete or unfashionable outweighed these concerns for many wearers. The fact that the eyebrows originated from vermin was less important than the fact that they allowed a woman to move through, caught with her dignity intact. The disturbing fascination of the mouse fur eyebrow lies in its combination of absurdity and desperation. On one hand, it reveals the resourcefulness of people who refused to accept physical decline. On the other, it highlights how toxic cosmetics created the very problem that then demanded such bizarre remedies. The cycle is a familiar one in the history of beauty. Damage caused by one fashion is patched over with another, often more dangerous or ridiculous than the first. Portraits from the Georgian period rarely reveal this secret, for artists flattered their sitters with idealized brows. But beneath the oils and pastels, many courtiers may have been concealing their dependency on tiny patches of rodent fur. It is a detail that adds a layer of irony to the grandeur of the Georgian look. Beneath the wigs, stacked with powder and ribbons, and above the cheeks tinted with mercury-based rouge, the very symbol of expression was often a borrowed fragment from the most humble of creatures. This episode in Cosmetic History reminds us that beauty standards are rarely logical. They arise from a mix of cultural expectations, social pressures, and technological limits. The Georgian elite, unwilling to appear imperfect, turned to the macabre without hesitation. And as bizarre as it seems, the mouse fur eyebrow was not unique in demanding extravagant sacrifice. In other parts of the world, and even in overlapping European traditions, elites pursued radiance through another extravagant measure, grinding down pearls and gemstones to drink in costly elixirs, believing that vitality itself could be swallowed from the treasures of the earth. 7. Powdered pearls and gems elixirs. Across the opulent courts of Mughal India, Safavid Persia, Ming and Qing China, and even Renaissance and Baroque Europe, a strange belief flourished that vitality, beauty, and longevity could be ingested directly from the earth's most precious treasures. Powdered pearls, ground gemstones, and liquefied metals were not merely symbols of wealth to wear on the body. They were swallowed in the form of elixirs, promising youth, radiant skin, and eternal vigor. To modern sensibilities, the idea of drinking crushed jewels sounds like alchemy gone mad, but for many royals, it represented the pinnacle of beauty science. The fascination with pearls, in particular, was widespread. In Mughal India, emperors and their consorts prized mukta pishti, a preparation of pearls ground into fine dust, often mixed with rose water or milk. Physicians in the royal court claimed it cooled the body, soothed the heart, and improved complexion. In Persia, pearls were likewise praised as calming tonics, and court physicians recommended them to noble women seeking both inner balance and outward radiance. In Europe, apothecaries sold similar concoctions to aristocrats who believed pearls could whiten the skin from within, making complexions appear translucent and free of blemishes. But pearls were only the beginning. Rubies were consumed to invigorate the blood, sapphires to steady the mind, and emeralds to sharpen eyesight. Gold and silver filings appeared in recipes for elixirs meant to strengthen the body and preserve youth. In some courts, entire cabinets of gems were kept not only as treasures to wear, but also as reserves for grinding into powders. The extravagance of swallowing jewels reinforced a powerful message. Only the wealthiest and most refined could afford such luxuries, and their bodies were literally infused with the essence of treasure. Critics, however, were never silent. Apothecaries and physicians often complained that such practices were wasteful at best and dangerous at worst. In Europe, medical satirists mocked wealthy ladies for turning their stomachs into jewel boxes, emptying treasuries into their digestion. They noted that the human body was ill-suited to process minerals in such raw forms. Digestive troubles, kidney stones, and abdominal pain were likely consequences of consuming gritty or metallic powders. In China, too, court physicians sometimes warned emperors that elixirs of immortality, particularly those involving mercury or gold, had ruined rulers before them. Despite these warnings, the allure of gem and pearl elixirs persisted for centuries because they embodied something deeper than mere fashion. They fused beauty rituals with the mystique of alchemy and the authority of medicine. To swallow pearls was not just to pursue pallor, it was to drink moonlight itself, to embody cosmic purity. To ingest rubies was to internalize fire and vitality. The symbolism lent spiritual legitimacy to what might otherwise be dismissed as folly. Equally significant was the performative aspect of such practices. Royals consumed these elixirs publicly, at banquets or during ritual ceremonies, as demonstrations of their wealth and power. A noble woman sipping a draught infused with powdered gems was not merely tending to her skin, she was enacting a spectacle of abundance. Her beauty was purchased at the price of treasure, signaling to all around her that her body itself was a jewel case. What makes the practice especially disturbing is the way it blurred lines between medicine, magic, and vanity. In some cases, these elixirs contained ingredients that were genuinely toxic. Mercury, often included in Chinese immortality tonics, caused tremors, madness, and death. Even pearls and gemstones, while less immediately poisonous, could wear down the digestive tract when taken repeatedly. Yet the social rewards of participation often outweighed the physical risks. To refuse such elixirs might mark one as backward or unrefined. The legacy of powdered pearl and gem elixirs is one of contradictions. On the one hand, they highlight the lengths to which royals would go to embody ideals of radiance and immortality. On the other, they expose the vulnerability of individuals trapped within systems that equated beauty with worth and wealth with health. The elixirs offered the illusion of vitality while quietly undermining the very bodies they promised to perfect. It is a sobering reminder of how beauty fads often take root in the space between science and superstition, sustained by symbolism and social pressure more than by efficacy. And while powdered gems might strike us today as the height of extravagance, they were far from the only bizarre substances consumed in royal courts. In France, another ritual emerged that was less glittering, but even more unsettling. Nobles deliberately drank from antimony-infused cups to induce vomiting, convinced that purging the body was the true path to health and beauty. 8. Antimony emetics and health cups. Among the most unsettling medical beauty fads of Europe's royal courts was the ritualized use of antimony, a silvery metalloid that found its way not into jewelry or ornament, but into the stomachs of kings, queens, and courtiers. Antimony compounds had long been used as emetics, substances that induce vomiting. In the 17th century, however, the French court transformed this grim practice into something of a fashion, elevating it from a physician's prescription into a lifestyle habit. At its height, the fad was so entrenched that nobles even drank wine from antimonial cups, goblets infused with antimony whose contents were believed to carry purgative and health-giving powers. The cultural logic behind this disturbing fad was rooted in the theory of humours, which dominated medicine for centuries. Health, it was believed, depended on the balance of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If any one humour grew excessive, disease and malaise followed. The solution? Purging, whether through bloodletting, laxatives, or vomiting. Antimony, with its powerful emetic qualities, seemed to provide a reliable means of resetting the body. To a modern reader, the image of nobles willingly poisoning themselves in order to vomit might seem grotesque, but within the context of the time, it was framed as disciplined self-care. At the court of Louis XIV, the use of antimony became a veritable craze. Physicians prescribed it not only for illness, but also for the maintenance of health. Drinking from antimonial cups, vessels made with antimony that leached trace amounts of the element into liquids, was touted as a gentle, ongoing way to purify the system. Nobles who wished to appear fashionable, enlightened, and health-conscious boasted of their dedication to the practice. Some even viewed it as a mark of sophistication, an embrace of modern medical science. The disturbing part of this fad lay in its intensity and its persistence despite criticism. Many physicians outside the orbit of Versailles warned that habitual use of antimony weakened the body rather than strengthened it. Repeated vomiting led to dehydration, nutrient loss, and long-term damage to the digestive tract. Some patients became dependent on the practice, believing they could not feel well unless they had undergone their purge. This dependency alarmed more cautious doctors who compared the craze to a dangerous addiction. Satirists and moralists also found much to criticize. Pamphlets circulated that mocked the nobility for clinging to goblets that made them sick. Critics ridiculed the absurdity of wealthy men and women deliberately emptying their stomachs in gilded halls, as though luxury could disguise folly. Yet satire, as in so many other cases, did little to halt the fad. The association between purging and health was too deeply ingrained, and the reinforcement of court culture too powerful for ridicule to undermine it. What makes the story of antimony so fascinating is its position between medicine and fashion. Initially, it was introduced as a treatment, justified within the framework of humoral theory. But as it spread among elites, it became more than therapy. It became a sign of refinement, a courtly ritual that marked one's membership in the world of sophistication. Drinking from an antimonial cup at Versailles was not just about health, it was about belonging to the cultural avant-garde. Historians now view this fad as a telling example of how medical practices can morph into status symbols. Antimony did not truly make its users healthier, but it offered the appearance of control, the sense that one was taking proactive steps to master the body. In an age when disease outbreaks were common and life expectancy uncertain, such illusions of control were powerful. They offered psychological reassurance even as the body weakened under the strain of repeated emesis. The legacy of antimony is cautionary. It shows how dangerous practices can be embraced and sustained when they align with cultural ideals of health, beauty, and belonging. It also reminds us that the court, with its competitive display of refinement, often encouraged excess in the very name of discipline. To prove oneself fashionable was to push the body to extremes, whether with paint, pearls, or poison, and antimony was only the beginning of such rituals at Versailles. If nobles were willing to poison themselves in the name of purification, they were equally willing to embrace practices of wellness that shocked outsiders for their frequency and extravagance. Among the most curious of these was the aristocratic obsession with enemas, sometimes flavored with coffee or wine, a fad that turned intimate medical procedures into symbols of luxury and indulgence. 9. Coffee and wine, enemas at Versailles. When we picture the splendor of Versailles, we often imagine glittering halls, polished marble, and resplendent courtiers gathered beneath chandeliers. Yet behind this facade of elegance lay a world of peculiar health and beauty practices that revealed just how far nobles would go in pursuit of wellness and refinement. Among the strangest was the aristocratic fascination with enemas, frequent ritualized procedures believed to cleanse the body of impurities. While enemas themselves had long histories in medicine, the French court of the 17th and 18th centuries elevated them into a fashion, turning what should have been an occasional remedy into an almost daily routine. What made the Versailles fad even more astonishing was the introduction of luxury ingredients, Coffee, wine, and sometimes even chocolate were infused into these enemas, merging indulgence with purgation in a way that astonished critics both then and now. The popularity of this practice cannot be separated from the medical theories of the time. As with antimony, the belief in humoral balance dominated medical thought. Enemas were seen as a gentler alternative to vomiting or bloodletting, purging excess humours from the body without as much visible distress. At Versailles, where appearances mattered as much as health, the enema seemed almost elegant compared to the indignities of other treatments. Doctors encouraged their use, claiming that regular enemas prevented illness, improved skin tone, and enhanced vitality. Nobles seized upon this idea, interpreting it not only as medical wisdom, but also as a fashionable habit, one that signaled modernity and refinement. By the reign of Louis XIV, enemas had become such a fixture of court life that they were performed with almost theatrical regularity. The Sun King himself reportedly underwent thousands of them over his lifetime, treating them as essential to maintaining his vigor. Courtiers, eager to imitate the monarch, adopted the same routine, sometimes receiving enemas multiple times a week. For them, it was not merely a private health practice, but a public declaration of belonging to the sophisticated world of Versailles. The infusion of luxury substances made the practice even more emblematic of court culture. Coffee and chocolate were new, exotic imports to Europe, prized as stimulating and invigorating. Wine, long associated with vitality and festivity, also found its way into the mixtures. These substances were believed to refresh the body from within, their energizing qualities seeping directly into the system. The choice of such ingredients was not entirely irrational. Coffee and chocolate were indeed stimulants, but their delivery through enemas reflected a bizarre conflation of indulgence and medicine. To cleanse with coffee or wine was to marry two hallmarks of noble life, excess and refinement. Critics of the time did not remain silent. Physicians outside the court warned that the overuse of enemas weakened the natural functions of the body, leaving individuals dependent upon artificial interventions. Moralists and satirists found rich material in the obsession, mocking the nobility for their intimate indulgences. Pamphlets circulated that ridiculed Versailles as a place where luxury extended even to the most private corners of life, where nobles could not resist turning even purgation into a performance. Yet, as with so many royal fads, ridicule did little to diminish enthusiasm. For courtiers, the benefits of appearing modern, disciplined, and in step with the king far outweighed the embarrassment of satire. What makes the enema craze particularly disturbing is how it blurred the boundaries between necessity and extravagance. A practice intended as occasional treatment became routine, even excessive, to the point that it risked undermining health rather than preserving it. Coffee and wine enemas reveal the paradox of Versailles, a court that prized elegance and restraint, yet indulged in extremes under the guise of refinement. Behind the polished etiquette and elaborate rituals lay a culture willing to embrace almost anything if it promised youth, beauty, or vitality. The legacy of this practice is less about medicine than about image. Versailles was a stage upon which courtiers performed not only their manners and costumes, but also their very health. To participate in the enema fad was to declare oneself modern, attentive, and aligned with the rhythms of courtly life. It was less about whether the procedure worked, and more about what it signified. And if nobles were willing to embrace such invasive rituals for their health, they were equally willing to accept dangers closer to the surface. Fashion, after all, demanded not only purification of the inside, but also elaborate construction of the outside. In the 18th century, nothing embodied this contradiction more vividly than the colossal wigs of the era, powdered, perfumed, and sculpted with lard, yet crawling with hazards that made them both spectacular and disturbing. 10. Lard and powder megawigs. In the dazzling salons of 18th century Europe, No accessory declared wealth and refinement more loudly than the towering wigs that crowned the heads of aristocrats. Worn by both men and women, these wigs could rise to extraordinary heights, elaborately sculpted into architectural marvels that rivaled the chandeliers above them. They were dusted with perfumed powders, adorned with ribbons, feathers, or even miniature ships and gardens. To the casual observer, they appeared as testaments to creativity, artistry, and aristocratic grandeur. Yet beneath their shimmering surface lay a far less elegant truth. The very construction of these wigs, set with animal fat and lead powder, created a disturbing world of stench, vermin, and fire hazards that made them as grotesque as they were glamorous. The foundation of these coiffures was lard or pomatum, a fatty, sticky base smeared onto hair and wig fibers to hold elaborate styles in place. This substance provided the grip needed to build towering hairpieces that might endure hours of dancing, conversation, or carriage rides. On top of the lard came liberal doses of white powder, often made from flour or starch, though in many cases lead powder was still used to achieve a dazzling pale effect. Together, these ingredients transformed hair into sculpted monuments, but they also emitted odors as the animal fats turned rancid, drawing pests and generating an unpleasant miasma beneath the glamour. Pamphlets and satirical prints of the era seized on the grotesque realities. Caricaturists depicted fashionable ladies and gentlemen with rats peeking from their coiffures, or servants armed with sticks to ward off vermin as their masters slept. The jokes contained truth. Lard and flour created a ready food source for mice and lice, and accounts circulated of infestations hidden within the towering wigs. Maintaining them was a constant challenge. Many aristocrats slept sitting upright to preserve the styles, while attendants devoted hours to repowdering, deodorizing, and repairing the fragile constructions. Beyond vermin, the wigs posed another danger: fire. The tall, powdered coiffures often brushed dangerously close to candles in ballrooms and dining halls. Satirists gleefully exaggerated stories of wigs catching alight, sending fashionable ladies fleeing in panic. Whether all the tales were true or not, the risk was real enough that pamphlets warned of the combustible mixture of starch, powder, and fat. The wigs, symbols of luxury, could quickly become literal torches. Physicians also weighed in, concerned about the effects of lead powder and the strain of heavy wigs on the body. Lead, absorbed through the scalp or inhaled in powder form, contributed to headaches, tremors, and gradual poisoning. Some doctors noted that wearers often complained of sore necks or posture problems from supporting the massive creations. Yet despite these concerns, wigs remained central to courtly fashion. To appear bareheaded or with a modest hairstyle risked looking provincial, out of touch, or even disrespectful. The sheer extravagance of the wigs reflected the culture of the time. In the courts of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, fashion was theatre, and the body itself was the stage. Wigs allowed nobles to compete for attention in an environment where visibility equated to influence. A coiffure that soared a foot above the head or contained elaborate symbols, ships celebrating naval victories, or gardens sprouting silk flowers, was more than ornament. It was a political and social statement. The willingness to endure vermin, odors, and danger testified to the enormous pressures of display at court. For satirists and moralists, the wigs epitomized the folly of aristocratic excess. They mocked nobles for carrying a miniature ecosystem on their heads, for suffocating under their own symbols of vanity. Yet, as with so many fads, mockery was powerless against the allure of fashion. Nobles continued to parade their wigs, convinced that the grandeur they projected outweighed the indignities hidden beneath. What makes this fad particularly disturbing is how it transformed discomfort and hazard into status symbols. The greater the wig, the greater the implied wealth, since maintaining such an edifice required constant care from skilled hairdressers and servants. Suffering, whether through stiff necks, rancid odors, or the threat of fire, was reframed as evidence of refinement. Pain and risk became part of the price of elegance. Eventually, revolution and shifting tastes brought the wig craze to an end, but the memory of those towering, pest-ridden, powder-laden structures endures as a symbol of a courtly world where appearances mattered more than health or comfort. And if European aristocrats were willing to endanger themselves for dazzling hair, they were equally willing to paint their very skin with deadly substances. In both East and West, the quest for brilliant rouge led nobles to embrace cinnabar, mercury sulfide, a cosmetic that promised radiance but often delivered tremors, madness, and decline. 11. Cinnabar rouge, mercury. Across the grand courts of both Europe and Asia, cheeks stained with brilliant red were more than cosmetic flourishes. They were statements of health, vitality, and allure. Yet one of the most striking and dangerous ways to achieve this look involved cinnabar, a mineral form of mercury sulfide. From imperial China to the palaces of Europe, cinnabar rouge was prized for its intense, almost luminous hue. It outshone plant-based alternatives, refusing to fade under candlelight or crumble with time. But its beauty came at a heavy price. Cinnabar, when applied to the skin or inhaled during its preparation, introduced mercury into the body, with consequences that ranged from trembling hands to deteriorating nerves and mental decline. In China, cinnabar had long been associated with alchemy and immortality. Taoist practitioners valued it for its supposed life-extending properties, and emperors incorporated it into both medicines and cosmetics. Court ladies used cinnabar rouge on their lips and cheeks, believing it conveyed youth and divine radiance. The mineral's striking color carried symbolic weight, tied to vitality, passion, and cosmic balance. Portraits from the Ming and Qing periods often show aristocratic women with vividly flushed cheeks, evidence of this enduring association. Yet medical texts of the time also warned against its overuse, noting cases of trembling, weakness, and early death linked to cinnabar ingestion or constant exposure. In Europe, particularly during the Renaissance and into the 18th century, cinnabar became a fashionable cosmetic ingredient as well. Its pigment, known as vermilion, was used not only in art, but also in rouge powders applied by both men and women of status. The brilliance of its red outclassed most natural alternatives, giving cheeks a distinctive glow admired at court and in society's salons. To appear with pale, bloodless skin suggested frailty, while a well-rouged cheek was linked to youthfulness and energy. For courtiers constantly competing for notice, the allure of cinnabar's brilliance often overshadowed concerns about its toxicity. Yet signs of its dangers were visible even in its heyday. Physicians and apothecaries recorded cases of painter's tremor or madness of the paint, symptoms tied to long-term mercury exposure. Users of cinnabar rouge sometimes developed shaking hands, mood swings, or neurological decline. Still, because the connection between cosmetics and illness was not always clear, or because it was inconvenient to acknowledge, many dismissed the warnings. The allure of a radiant cheek, the promise of standing out under candlelight, was too tempting to abandon. Satirists, of course, found material in the fad. Pamphlets and plays occasionally mocked noble women for disguising pallor and ill health under a toxic mask, calling their glow a borrowed bloom. Critics sneered that beauty achieved by cinnabar was both artificial and destructive, a facade hiding deterioration. Despite these commentaries, demand persisted because the rouge was effective at delivering what society demanded, an unmistakable, commanding flush of color. What makes cinnabar rouge especially disturbing is its dual role as both adornment and poison. Unlike more obviously grotesque practices, such as Cece's raw veal masks or the towering lard-laden wigs, cinnabar appeared elegant, even refined. Its dangers were insidious, often revealing themselves slowly, long after the admiration it inspired had faded. This duality made it particularly treacherous, trapping its users in a cycle where maintaining beauty meant courting decline. The legacy of Cinnabar Rouge is a powerful reminder of how beauty standards can entangle individuals in destructive choices. Whether in Beijing, Paris, or Madrid, the brilliance of red cheeks symbolized vitality, but the reality was often weakness born of slow poisoning. It highlights the paradox at the heart of so many royal beauty fads. What made one appear more alive could, in truth, hasten decay. And Cinnabar was not the only mercury-laden cosmetic to seduce the courts. If rouge brought vibrancy to the cheeks, other mercury compounds promised to erase blemishes, smooth scars, and restore a youthful glow to damaged complexions. From Tudor England to Stuart salons, nobles reached for ointments infused with mercury, convinced that they held the secret to perfect skin, even as they loosened teeth, corroded gums, and quietly ravaged the nervous system. 12. Mercury ointments for clear skin. In the glittering courts of Tudor and Stuart England, smooth, unblemished skin was one of the most coveted signs of nobility. Yet the 16th and 17th centuries were also ravaged by outbreaks of smallpox, a disease that left survivors with deep scars and pockmarks. For queens, courtiers, and ambitious nobles, these marks were more than medical reminders, they were social stigmas. Into this world entered a disturbing remedy: ointments laced with mercury, touted as miracle cures to smooth the complexion and erase the traces of disease. Mercury, in both liquid and salt forms, was widely known in early modern Europe. Physicians prescribed it to treat syphilis and other ailments, believing that its corrosive qualities could purge the body of infection. When adapted for cosmetics, mercury was mixed into balms, creams, and salves. Advertised as beautifying or healing, these ointments promised to dissolve scars, lighten discolorations, and restore youthful smoothness. Apothecaries and court physicians recommended them, and nobles desperate to preserve their beauty embraced them with enthusiasm. The results, at least superficially, could appear convincing. Mercury's caustic action irritated the skin, causing it to peel or shed, temporarily revealing fresher layers beneath. Applied repeatedly, it could reduce the visibility of shallow scars and brighten pallor. For nobles navigating the unforgiving scrutiny of court life, this was worth the risk. Portraits from the era often idealized faces, smoothing away blemishes, but behind the painted canvases lay real anxieties. To appear scarred was to risk being judged as weak, ill-favored, or less desirable. Mercury ointments seemed like salvation, yet the dangers of this practice were well recognized even in its own time. Surgeons and physicians began noting that habitual users of mercurial ointments suffered troubling side effects: loosening teeth, inflamed gums, drooling, trembling hands, and nervous complaints. The phrase "salivated by mercury" entered medical vocabulary, describing the excess saliva and oral damage caused by the treatments. Some sufferers endured chronic mouth ulcers or nerve damage, but because results were gradual and often masked by the very ointments that caused them, users persisted. The ointments created a cycle. Scars were less visible, but the face required constant reapplication to hide the damage mercury itself inflicted. The disturbing quality of this fad lies not only in its physical harm, but also in the social dynamics that fueled it. Nobles were not passive victims, but active participants in a system that equated beauty with power. For women in particular, appearance could determine marriage prospects, political alliances, and influence at court. To forego the ointments was to risk falling behind rivals who appeared unblemished. Even men, though often less pressured, sought to preserve a dignified visage free of scars. Mercury ointments thus became less a matter of choice than of necessity, a toxic ritual enforced by the silent competitions of court life. Moralists and satirists did not fail to notice. Pamphlets mocked nobles who destroyed their health in pursuit of superficial perfection, likening them to moths drawn to a flame. Critics argued that the obsession with clear skin betrayed deeper vanity and weakness, especially in times when nations faced political turmoil. Still, ridicule rarely persuaded those under the weight of expectation. In a world where portraits traveled across kingdoms as tokens of marriage negotiations or political alliance, a scar could carry political consequences. Under such pressures, ointments, however dangerous, were irresistible. From a modern perspective, mercury ointments epitomize the paradox of cosmetic history. Substances known to be harmful were still embraced because they provided short-term improvements. They illustrate how the desire for perfection can override caution and how deeply courtly culture embedded beauty into identity and power. The ointments promised clarity but delivered corrosion, offering a cruel trade that many nobles accepted. The story of mercury ointments also reminds us that toxic beauty was not confined to faces alone. While nobles smeared dangerous balms on their skin, other societies looked to more unusual substances to perfect another feature altogether: their smiles. In imperial Rome, elites sought gleaming white teeth, not through powders or pastes, but through a method that shocks modern sensibilities, using aged urine as a mouthwash, a practice praised for its whitening effect and ridiculed for its revolting origins. 13. Urine mouthwash. When we think of Roman imperial luxury, images of marble villas, golden goblets, and flowing togas often come to mind. Yet even in this world of grandeur, beauty and hygiene practices could descend into the downright disturbing. Among the most surprising was the elite Roman use of aged urine as a mouthwash, praised for its supposed ability to whiten teeth and freshen the breath. To the modern imagination, the practice seems almost unthinkable, yet to Romans of high status, including those within the imperial court, it was a ritual not only tolerated but celebrated as an effective cosmetic aid. The reasoning behind the practice stemmed from chemistry, even if ancient users did not articulate it in scientific terms. Urine, when left to stand, produces ammonia, a compound with cleansing and bleaching properties. Romans discovered that rinsing with this substance whitened the enamel, scrubbing away stains from wine, food, and the grit of daily life. In a culture where public speaking, dining, and display were constant, a bright smile was an asset. Teeth that appeared polished and white signaled youth, health, and status. Courtiers, senators, and noblewomen thus embraced what they saw as a practical solution to dental discoloration. The practice was not confined to Rome alone. Historical sources suggest that Portuguese urine was particularly prized for this purpose, imported across the empire at considerable cost. That elites were willing to pay for jars of another nation's waste product underscores how firmly entrenched the fad had become. For Romans, it was less about the substance's origins than about its results. If aged urine delivered whiteness and polish, then its unappealing source was overlooked, much as later European aristocrats ignored the poisons in lead makeup or arsenic wafers. Literary sources reveal both fascination and mockery. Poets such as Catullus joked about the practice, satirizing those who relied on urine rinses to achieve their sparkling smiles. He quipped that beneath the gleam lay the foulest of origins, suggesting that beauty achieved by such means was compromised by its method. Yet the satire only highlights how common the practice must have been among the wealthy to make it a target of ridicule. If it were rare or obscure, it would not have drawn such pointed commentary. From a medical perspective, urine mouthwash offered some genuine cleaning power, but at a cost. While ammonia could indeed whiten teeth, prolonged use risked weakening enamel or irritating gums. The strong odor, too, lingered, raising doubts about whether the freshness it promised truly outweighed its stench. Nevertheless, Roman elites, accustomed to extreme luxuries and strange indulgences, found in the practice a ritual that aligned with their ideals of beauty and order. Just as aqueducts purified water and baths cleansed the body, so too could a mouth rinse, however unusual, purify the smile. The disturbing element lies not simply in the substance itself, but in the cultural values that sustained it. For Romans, the pursuit of beauty was intertwined with discipline, wealth, and spectacle. To maintain gleaming teeth was to participate in the performance of status, even if the method was unsavory. Much like powdered pearls in Mughal courts or cinnabar rouge in Europe, urine mouthwash reveals how far people would go when social competition demanded flawlessness. This fad also underscores a recurring theme in the history of cosmetic practices: the willingness to normalize what seems bizarre so long as it produces visible results. What shocks us today may have seemed pragmatic, even sophisticated, in its own time. To Romans, the smile mattered enough to justify almost anything, and as unusual as the mouthwash seems, it was hardly the only disturbing compromise between hygiene and elegance. Centuries later, in European courts, another form of concealment would dominate: lavish perfumes applied in heavy layers, intended to mask odors that clung to bodies unwashed for weeks. This shift from cleansing to covering reminds us that in the world of beauty fads, appearances mattered far more than the underlying reality. 14. Perfumes over bathing. In early modern Europe, especially during the Renaissance and Baroque periods, the aristocracy developed an approach to personal hygiene that seems paradoxical to us today. While courts, such as those of France and England, are remembered for their glittering fashions, elaborate etiquette, and ornate architecture, they are equally remembered for a reluctance to bathe. Instead of regular washing, nobles often turned to heavy perfumes made from musk, civet, ambergris, and floral distillates. These fragrances were layered onto skin, clothing, and wigs, not merely as accessories, but as substitutes for cleanliness. Perfume became a second skin, a cloud of scent masking the odors of bodies that were rarely scrubbed. The roots of this practice lay partly in medical theory. In the wake of medieval plagues, many physicians warned against frequent bathing. They believed that warm water opened the pores, leaving the body vulnerable to miasmas or bad airs thought to carry disease. Clean skin, paradoxically, was considered exposed skin, fragile, permeable, and at risk. For this reason, nobles often restricted bathing to a few times per year, preferring to wipe themselves with cloths or apply scented oils to the surface rather than immerse in water. Into this cultural framework, perfumes fit perfectly, offering a way to manage appearances without courting supposed medical dangers. Perfume also carried symbolic weight. Musk and civet, extracted from animal glands, produced heavy, lingering scents that projected power and sensuality. Ambergris, harvested from Wales, was rare and costly, conferring prestige on anyone who wore it. Floral distillations, rose, lavender, violet, added layers of refinement. By combining these ingredients, perfumers created complex blends that clung to fabrics and skin, announcing a noble's presence before they even entered a room. A heavily perfumed body was a status symbol, proclaiming access to exotic trade networks and expensive luxuries. Yet critics were not silent. Moralists and satirists wrote disdainfully about the practice, arguing that perfumes concealed vice rather than virtue. Pamphlets mocked nobles who, under their silken garments, carried stench under silk, as one critic phrased it. Physicians, too, sometimes complained that perfumes irritated the lungs or masked underlying illness. The sharpness of civet and musk was divisive, even among contemporaries, some finding it alluring, others suffocating. Nevertheless, the trend persisted, for the alternative, appearing with natural odors in the refined spaces of court, was unthinkable. The disturbing quality of this fad lay in its transformation of fragrance from enhancement to necessity. Courtiers could not simply choose to forego perfumes without risking ridicule or exclusion. A noblewoman who appeared unscented might be judged unfashionable. A nobleman without fragrance might seem careless or unrefined. Perfume became armor, shielding individuals from both literal and social contamination. The body beneath might remain unwashed, but the illusion of cleanliness and sophistication was sustained through layers of musk and civet. Perfume culture at court also shaped architecture and etiquette. At Versailles, for instance, rooms were often fumigated with burning incense or pastilles, and courtiers carried pomanders, small ornate containers filled with aromatic substances, both as accessories and as shields against unpleasant odors. Perfume was thus woven into the very fabric of elite life, infiltrating everything from clothing care to public rituals. What began as a medical precaution against disease became a social requirement, entrenching itself as part of aristocratic identity. From a modern perspective, the reliance on perfume over bathing is unsettling because it represents a triumph of appearance over reality. The nobility were not truly clean. They merely projected cleanliness through clouds of scent. The practice reveals the extent to which court culture valued the performance of refinement above actual well-being. It also underscores a recurring theme in royal beauty fads. Discomfort, risk, or absurdity was secondary to maintaining the illusion of perfection. The irony, of course, is that perfumes could never fully suppress the underlying truth. Diaries and memoirs from the era occasionally remark on the mingling of heavy musk with less pleasant odors, creating a cloying atmosphere that was both overwhelming and inescapable. Still, the persistence of the fad speaks to the power of collective belief. If everyone agreed perfume equaled elegance, then the illusion held. Yet this was not the only beauty fad in history that sacrificed health for aesthetics. While European nobles drenched themselves in fragrance, across the globe another practice, foot binding in imperial China, pushed the pursuit of beauty to extremes of pain and lifelong disability. This next fad demonstrates that the demands of fashion could reshape not just appearances, but the very structure of the human body. 15. Foot binding in imperial China. Few beauty practices in history embody both the cultural weight of aesthetics and the disturbing cost to the human body as vividly as foot binding in imperial China. This practice, which endured for nearly 1,000 years, reshaped the very bones of young girls' feet in pursuit of a courtly ideal of grace and refinement. Though often associated with the elite, foot binding eventually permeated many levels of society, yet its origins and endurance were deeply rooted in the aristocratic world. To understand its disturbing nature, one must look not only at the physical toll, but also at the cultural pressures that made such suffering both normalized and celebrated. The practice likely began in the Song dynasty and spread across subsequent dynasties, becoming entrenched by the Ming and Qing courts. For the nobility, small feet, often referred to as lotus feet, were seen as the ultimate sign of beauty, elegance, and desirability. In courtly poetry and art, bound feet were praised as delicate, arousing, and refined. The gait they produced, a swaying shuffle, was celebrated as irresistibly graceful. Small feet were also symbolic of status. A woman with bound feet was incapable of performing manual labor, signaling that she belonged to a family wealthy enough to spare her from work. The process, however, was excruciating. Young girls, often between the ages of 4 and 9, had their feet tightly bound with cloth, bending and breaking the arch to reduce length. Over time, the ideal foot size shrank to about 3 inches, celebrated as the golden lotus. While modern audiences recoil at the thought of children undergoing such a transformation, in imperial China it was seen as essential preparation for entry into elite society. Families seeking advantageous marriages for their daughters often felt compelled to enforce the practice, knowing that unbound feet could condemn a girl to lower social prospects. Critics did exist even within its own time. Some officials and reform-minded intellectuals condemned foot-binding as cruel and debilitating. Confucian moralists occasionally argued that it weakened women unnecessarily, making them less capable of fulfilling domestic duties. Physicians too noted the physical consequences: lifelong pain, difficulty walking, and susceptibility to infection. Yet these criticisms rarely overcame the cultural momentum that framed small feet as the pinnacle of feminine beauty. For every critique, countless poems, paintings, and love songs reinforced the ideal, making resistance seem not only unfashionable but socially dangerous. What makes foot binding particularly disturbing when compared to other royal beauty fads is its permanence. While wigs could be removed and lead makeup washed off, bound feet were irreversible. The practice left a lifelong imprint on the body, confining women not only physically but also socially. Bound feet limited mobility, keeping women dependent on families and husbands. This dependency was sometimes framed as desirable within the patriarchal order, for it reinforced ideals of female fragility and reliance. Yet from another perspective, it represents one of the starkest examples of beauty standards functioning as tools of control. Despite its cruelty, many women embraced the practice themselves, internalizing the cultural value placed on small feet. Mothers bound their daughters' feet not out of malice, but out of hope for their future, believing that the pain was necessary for securing good marriages and ensuring social stability. This generational cycle demonstrates how beauty standards can entrench themselves so deeply that those most harmed by them also become their enforcers. The eventual decline of foot binding came only with sustained reform movements in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when Chinese intellectuals, influenced by Western ideas and modernization, began to denounce it as backward and harmful. Campaigns against the practice gained traction, and by the early Republican era, official bans were introduced. Yet the persistence of the custom for centuries highlights its extraordinary cultural power. It endured not because people were unaware of the harm, but because the pressures of conformity and status proved stronger than individual well-being. Today, foot binding stands as one of the most infamous examples of beauty pursued at terrible cost. It reminds us that aesthetics are never simply personal. They are woven into systems of class, gender, and power. For imperial Chinese nobles, bound feet were a badge of refinement, but for the women who endured it, they were also lifelong shackles disguised as ornaments. And just as corsets in Europe would later compress women's bodies into unnaturally narrow forms, so too did bound feet reveal the extremes to which societies have gone in reshaping the human form. In Habsburg Vienna, Victorian London, and beyond, another beauty fad would echo the same logic of restriction, this time not at the feet, but at the waist, where tight-lacing corsets promised elegance yet delivered suffocation and displaced organs. 16. Extreme tight lacing. In the courts of Europe, particularly from the late 17th century through the height of the Victorian era, one of the most persistent and controversial beauty fads was the corset. While corsetry in itself had been a feature of fashion for centuries, what made the 18th and 19th centuries remarkable was the obsession with tight lacing, the practice of pulling corsets so tightly that the waist was drastically narrowed, producing the much-admired wasp waist figure. This was not a fleeting fad of costume balls or theatrical displays. It was an everyday ritual for aristocratic women and later for much of polite society. And though it became a symbol of elegance and refinement, tight lacing was also a source of profound discomfort, medical alarm, and social satire. The ideal figure varied across time, but by the 18th century, a small waist had become an essential marker of beauty and status. Portraits from Habsburg Vienna and later Victorian London reveal women with astonishingly narrow waists, accentuated by voluminous skirts and elaborate gowns. Achieving this silhouette required not just the corset, but its extreme tightening, often with the help of maids or attendants who pulled the laces until the body conformed to the fashionable proportions. For many women, the corset became both a tool of transformation and a cage, reshaping not only their appearance, but their very anatomy. Medical voices of the time grew increasingly alarmed at the consequences. Physicians documented cases of corset liver, a condition where the constant pressure deformed the organ shape. Others noted displaced ribs, restricted breathing, fainting spells, and digestive issues. Women who wore tightly laced corsets for hours on end risked permanent changes to their skeletal structure, including compressed spines and distorted rib cages. Reports circulated of young girls fainting at dances or during carriage rides, their constricted lungs unable to keep pace with the demands of social life. Yet these symptoms, far from discouraging the practice, were sometimes reframed as signs of delicate femininity, proof that a woman's body was fragile and refined. Satirists seized on the fad, producing pamphlets and caricatures that mocked noble women for sacrificing comfort and health in pursuit of fashion. Cartoons depicted women fainting at social gatherings or struggling to breathe, their bodies squeezed into impossible shapes. Critics derided corsets as symbols of vanity and superficiality, while moralists argued they reflected broader social corruption. But for all the ridicule, the practice persisted, reinforced by cultural ideals that equated beauty with discipline and control. A tightly laced waist suggested not only refinement, but also moral restraint, as if the body itself testified to the wearer's virtue. What makes tight lacing particularly disturbing is how it blurred the lines between beauty, status, and suffering. Women who endured the practice were not ignorant of the discomfort it was impossible to ignore. Yet many accepted the pain as part of their duty to embody aristocratic ideals. In some cases, young girls were introduced to corsets at an early age, their bodies gradually molded to suit the silhouette expected of them. The corset thus became not only a garment, but a mechanism of social training, binding individuals into conformity with courtly expectations. Even as medical evidence mounted against extreme tight lacing, defenders of the practice remained steadfast. Some women claimed they enjoyed the sensation of support, while others insisted that health warnings were exaggerated. The allure of the wasp waist was simply too powerful, reinforced by fashion plates, portraits, and the admiration of peers. For ambitious women navigating the rigid hierarchies of court, a narrow waist could mean greater visibility, better prospects, and higher status. The corset's embrace, however stifling, was also an embrace of opportunity. From a modern perspective, extreme tight lacing epitomizes the paradox of many royal beauty fads, practices that offered symbolic power while inflicting real harm. The wasp waist was admired as a triumph of elegance, but it was achieved at the expense of breath, comfort, and health. It reveals how societies can normalize suffering when it is reframed as sophistication, turning pain into a badge of belonging. The obsession with reshaping the body did not end at the waist. Just as nobles tightened corsets to compress their figures, earlier societies had experimented with chemical concoctions to alter their hair, believing that beauty could be manufactured through dangerous substances. Among the Romans and later Europeans, one of the most disturbing examples was the use of lead acetate hair darkeners, cosmetic sugar of lead solutions that promised to restore youthful color while quietly poisoning the very bodies they adorned. 17. Lead acetate hair darkeners. The pursuit of youth and beauty has always involved fighting the visible signs of aging, and in the courts of ancient Rome and later in early modern Europe, one of the most feared markers of decline was grey hair. While noble women and noblemen alike draped themselves in silks, jewels, and cosmetics to project vigor and refinement, strands of silver betrayed the passage of time. To combat this, elites turned to one of the most disturbing cosmetic solutions of history: hair darkeners made from lead acetate, commonly called sugar of lead. This chemical concoction promised to restore youthful color to fading locks, but in practice it introduced poison directly onto the scalp, seeping into the body and causing harm far greater than a few gray hairs. The use of lead-based hair darkeners stretches back to antiquity. Roman aristocrats mixed vinegar with lead, producing a sweet-tasting compound that could be applied to hair as a dye. Writers of the period noted that the mixture darkened tresses effectively, returning them to a glossy black or deep brown. For courtiers and senators anxious about maintaining their dignity in public life, the appeal was obvious. Appearance was a form of currency in Rome, and to look prematurely aged could undermine authority, desirability, or influence. Thus, sugar of lead became a popular, if dangerous, remedy. By the Renaissance and into the 18th century, the practice resurfaced with new vigor. Manuals on beauty and grooming recommended lead solutions as reliable restorers of youthful color. Apothecaries sold them to clients of wealth, and nobles treated their hair with these darkeners before social gatherings or portraits. The effect, at least temporarily, was striking. Graying strands turned sleek and dark, lending the illusion of vigor, but the price was steep. Even in antiquity, there were warnings. Roman naturalists like Pliny the Elder wrote of the dangers of lead, noting its corrosive and harmful properties. Physicians observed that habitual users of lead hair dyes suffered from headaches, tremors, and cognitive decline, symptoms of lead poisoning. Some contemporaries even remarked wryly that while the dyes blackened the hair, they also blackened the brain. Yet such warnings rarely deterred the ambitious. In a world where power and favor depended heavily on appearance, sacrificing health for beauty seemed an acceptable, if unspoken, bargain. The disturbing nature of this fad becomes clearer when one considers how widespread and normalized it became. Royals, aristocrats, and courtiers willingly applied poison to their heads day after day, entrusting their health to a chemical that corroded not only the body, but also, in a sense, the truth. Grey hair was a natural marker of age and wisdom, yet society framed it as shameful, demanding concealment. By submitting to lead dyes, nobles transformed their very bodies into illusions, hiding time's passage even as the substance accelerated decline. Satirists and moralists found ample material in this contradiction. Pamphlets mocked vain courtiers who sought to disguise old age, suggesting that their darkened locks fooled no one and that their trembling hands betrayed the hidden cost of their vanity. Yet ridicule rarely halted the practice. Fashion plates, portraits, and the examples of monarchs themselves reinforced the ideal of youthful, glossy hair, making lead darkeners not just acceptable, but expected. The medical consequences of chronic lead exposure were profound. Users often experienced fatigue, abdominal pain, and neurological problems. Some lost their hair altogether, the very condition they had sought to conceal. Others developed pallor or behavioral changes, signs that contemporaries sometimes described as melancholy or madness. Despite this, the market for lead-based hair products endured well into the 19th century, showing just how strong the demand for youthfulness remained. From a modern perspective, lead acetate hair darkeners reveal the disturbing intersection of vanity, social expectation, and toxic science. They remind us that many royal beauty fads were not mere eccentricities, but deeply entrenched practices sustained by cultural ideals. To appear young was to remain relevant, and to remain relevant was to survive in the ruthless world of court politics. The story of sugar of lead also sets the stage for another deeply ingrained practice that spanned centuries: the use of bloodletting as a means of not only preserving health, but also enhancing appearance. Royals across Europe submitted to seasonal bleedings, convinced that it balanced their humors and purified their bodies. Yet critics then and now saw it as wasteful, dangerous, and one of the most disturbing intersections of beauty, medicine, and ritual in courtly life. 18. Bloodletting for beauty and balance. For centuries, bloodletting stood at the center of European medicine, practiced not only in hospitals and monasteries, but also in the grandest palaces of kings and queens. The belief was simple, yet pervasive. Health and beauty depended on maintaining the balance of the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If illness, fatigue, or even a blemished complexion appeared, physicians interpreted it as a sign that the humors were out of alignment. The most direct way to restore balance, they argued, was to draw blood. For royals and nobles, this practice became routine, woven into seasonal cycles, and prescribed as much for maintaining appearances as for treating ailments. The idea of beauty through bloodletting might sound strange to modern ears, but within the framework of humoral theory, it made sense. Excess blood was thought to cause ruddiness, swelling, or eruptions on the skin. By carefully bleeding a patient, physicians believed they could refine the complexion, reduce puffiness, and bestow a pale, aristocratic glow. Court ladies and men of status submitted to the procedure not only when sick, but also in anticipation of important appearances, banquets, weddings, or diplomatic gatherings. The act of losing blood was reframed as a ritual of purification, a sacrifice for elegance as well as health. Royal physicians often maintained strict calendars for their noble patients. Bleedings were scheduled seasonally. Spring and autumn were considered especially important times to rebalance the body. Records from Tudor and Bourbon courts describe monarchs undergoing regular sessions, often performed by trusted surgeons or barber surgeons. Some rulers even prided themselves on their discipline in submitting to the practice, treating it as evidence of rational self-control. For courtiers, following the same regimen reinforced their image as enlightened and health-conscious, fully in step with prevailing medical wisdom. But beneath this ritualized order lay disturbing consequences. Repeated bloodletting weakened the body, sometimes fatally. Fragile royals, already prone to illness due to inbreeding or poor diets, became even more vulnerable after frequent bleedings. Physicians debated among themselves whether the practice was being overused, warning that excessive loss of blood led to fainting, long-term debility, and shortened lifespans. Still, these cautions were rarely heeded. The prestige of the ritual, combined with the entrenched authority of humoral theory, kept the practice alive for centuries. Satirists and skeptics pointed out the absurdity of nobles weakening themselves in the name of beauty and health. They joked about courtiers who seemed to spend more time bleeding than living, their pallor less a mark of refinement than a symptom of chronic depletion. Yet satire carried little weight against the weight of tradition. So deeply was bloodletting tied to the image of discipline and purity that even when outcomes were visibly harmful, abandoning the practice seemed unthinkable. The disturbing aspect of royal bloodletting also lies in its symbolism. For nobles, blood was not only a physical substance, but a marker of lineage and divine right. To deliberately spill it under medical supervision was to demonstrate mastery over one's own body, as if even the essence of royalty could be controlled and refined. In this sense, bloodletting became both a medical procedure and a theatrical act, performed within the private chambers of monarchs, but echoing across the culture of courtly life. From a modern perspective, bloodletting reveals the paradox at the heart of many aristocratic beauty fads. It promised control over the body, but delivered vulnerability. It claimed to ensure elegance, but often produced fragility. That nobles clung to it so stubbornly underscores how cultural ideals, once entrenched, can resist even mounting evidence of harm. The legacy of bloodletting is one of persistence and caution. It endured not because it worked, but because it aligned with a worldview that prized balance, order, and discipline above all. It exemplifies how beauty and medicine were often inseparable in the royal imagination, each reinforcing the other in a cycle of ritual and risk. And if nobles were willing to surrender their vitality in the form of blood for the sake of appearance, they were equally willing to endure other unsettling treatments. In the 19th century, some high-born women turned to a practice that may sound even more unnerving, applying leeches directly to their lips to achieve a fashionable rosy flush, an eerie twist in the story of beauty as performance. 19. Leeches for lip color. In the 19th century, as romantic ideals and notions of delicate beauty swept across Europe, pale faces framed by vivid rosy lips became a hallmark of aristocratic fashion. Portraits and novels of the time often lingered on descriptions of a woman's lips as symbols of vitality, youth, and charm. Achieving this look, however, often required more than cosmetics. Among the stranger and more disturbing practices adopted by fashionable women of the aristocracy was the use of live leeches, applied directly to the lips to draw blood and create a temporary flush of color. This practice drew upon older medical traditions. Leeches had long been tools of physicians, used in bloodletting treatments for everything from headaches to fevers. Their popularity in medicine peaked in the early 19th century, when hirudotherapy swept across Europe and millions of leeches were harvested each year for use in clinics and households. The leap from medical use to cosmetic use was almost inevitable. If leeches could draw blood to cure ailments, why not also use them to summon the ruddy look of youthful vitality on demand? For aristocratic women, the attraction lay in the immediacy of the effect. After a leech fed briefly on the lip, the area swelled slightly and took on a deep red hue. This appearance mimicked the natural flush associated with health and desire, and under the glow of candlelight in ballrooms, it could look striking. Unlike powdered rouges, which could fade or smudge, the flush from a leech lasted longer and seemed less artificial. Some women claimed it gave their lips the freshness of youth, while others considered it a secret weapon in the competitive environment of salons and soirees. But the procedure carried risks that were apparent even at the time. Leeches could introduce infections, especially if reused or not properly handled. Their bites often left small wounds or uneven swelling that detracted from the desired effect. Physicians cautioned that repeated use could damage tissue or cause chronic irritation. Even sympathetic observers described the practice as unsettling, with tiny creatures dangling from women's lips in preparation for an evening event. The image, though perhaps routine in some aristocratic chambers, struck many outsiders as grotesque. Satirical writers and artists seized upon this fad as evidence of vanity gone too far. Caricatures showed elegant ladies reclining in dressing rooms with leeches clinging to their faces, mocking the contrast between refined aspiration and animalistic means. Commentators derided the idea that beauty could be coaxed by such crude methods, arguing that it revealed the desperation of a society obsessed with appearances. Yet, as with so many fads, mockery did not prevent its persistence. For those within courtly and high society circles, the pressure to maintain fashionable beauty outweighed the discomfort or indignity of the method. What makes this practice particularly disturbing is how it illustrates the lengths to which nobles would go for fleeting enhancements. The flush created by leeches was temporary, lasting hours at most. To repeat it required subjecting oneself again and again to the same discomfort and risk. Unlike wigs or makeup, which could be applied externally, this practice literally required a living creature to alter the body's appearance from within. It was an intimacy between parasite and host that blurred the line between medicine and vanity. From a broader perspective, the leech lip fad reflects a recurring theme in aristocratic beauty culture: the conflation of suffering with elegance. Pain, inconvenience, and even danger were reframed as investments in social standing. To endure the bite of a leech was to prove one's commitment to refinement, to display discipline in the pursuit of perfection. The body became a canvas upon which extremes were not only tolerated but expected. Today, the idea of using leeches for beauty might provoke shock or even humor, but in the 19th century, it was part of a continuum of practices that reveal the desperation driving cosmetic innovation. From lead and mercury to arsenic and antimony, nobles routinely embraced substances and procedures that harmed them in the long run, all for the sake of appearances. The leech craze fits seamlessly into this pattern, a fleeting glow achieved at the expense of comfort and health. And yet, as peculiar as the practice seems, it was hardly the most unsettling use of biological material in beauty regimens. Across both Asia and Europe, another fad emerged that prized the secretions of birds, particularly their droppings, as ingredients for whitening creams. What began in Japanese court recipes later crossed into Western fashion, creating another disturbing chapter in the history of royal cosmetics. 20. Pigeon-dropping face creams. Among the most unsettling beauty fads to emerge from the courts of Asia and later Europe was the use of bird droppings, particularly those of pigeons and nightingales, as a key ingredient in face creams. Known in Japan as ugisu no fun, or nightingale droppings, these creams were first embraced by aristocrats of the Heian period and continued to be prized by geishas and nobles in later centuries. They were valued for their supposed ability to lighten the skin, reduce blemishes, and create a porcelain-like glow. By the early modern era, variations of this practice even appeared in Europe, where recipes sometimes substituted pigeon guano. To many, the source of these creams was repellent, but their promise of luminous beauty made them surprisingly enduring. The origins of this fad are tied to cultural ideals of appearance. In Japan, pale, unblemished skin was associated with purity, refinement, and aristocratic status. Sun-darkened skin suggested labor and peasantry, while a pale complexion marked one as elevated above such concerns. Nightingale droppings, when dried, ground, and carefully treated, were said to contain enzymes that brightened the skin and smoothed texture. Geishas in particular valued them for removing the heavy white makeup they wore, which often contained harmful lead. The enzyme-rich guano not only cleansed but also left the skin luminous, reinforcing the association between elite cosmetics and unusual natural ingredients. In Europe, the adoption of guano-based face creams reflected similar pressures. The obsession with pallor persisted through the Renaissance and Baroque courts, where powdered faces symbolized both wealth and delicacy. Recipes circulated in beauty manuals recommending pigeon droppings mixed with vinegar or other bases to create whitening creams. Apothecaries sold such concoctions discreetly, and though some nobles balked at the idea, others embraced them, willing to overlook the source in exchange for results. The application of bird droppings to the skin was thus framed less as filth than as exotic medicine, transformed by context into a marker of sophistication. Yet not everyone was convinced. Critics, both then and now, have pointed out the unhygienic nature of using waste products on the skin. Physicians warned that the risk of infection was real, especially when the droppings were not sterilized. Satirists mocked nobles who, under their silken finery, resorted to such grotesque measures for the sake of fashion. Caricatures and poems painted a comic picture of courtiers smearing their faces with substances better suited to fertilizing fields than adorning queens. Still, these critiques rarely shook the resolve of those invested in the fad. As with other beauty practices, social pressures and the promise of perfection outweighed discomfort or ridicule. What makes this fad disturbing is not only the substance itself, but the lengths to which people were willing to go in order to achieve a desired complexion. In a world where beauty was equated with virtue and status, the use of pigeon or nightingale droppings was reframed as a sacrifice, an odd, even grotesque one, but a sacrifice nonetheless. For noblewomen and courtiers, the result mattered more than the process. If the face appeared luminous at the banquet or radiant in a portrait, the discomfort or disgust associated with the method was simply the price of elegance. This practice also reveals the blurred boundary between cosmetics and medicine in royal culture. Because guano had noticeable chemical effects, enzymes capable of breaking down proteins, it could be interpreted as therapeutic, almost scientific. This lent it a veneer of legitimacy that made it easier to justify. Much like powdered pearls or cinnabar rouge, the bird-dropping creams remind us that courtly cosmetics were rarely about safety. They were about effectiveness, symbolism, and above all, the relentless demand to project refinement. From a modern perspective, the fad is a striking reminder that beauty standards often override reason and revulsion alike. What shocks us today may have seemed practical, even elegant, in another time. For nobles who lived under constant scrutiny, the decision to apply such a cream was not madness, but conformity. It was a way to meet expectations that tolerated no imperfection, and yet, as bizarre as this reliance on guano might seem, it pales in comparison to another royal pursuit, the quest for immortality itself. In imperial China, some rulers went beyond cosmetics and hygiene, ingesting tonics infused with mercury, gold, and gemstones. These so-called elixirs of life promised eternal youth and cosmic power, but more often delivered madness and death. 21. Gem and metal-infused immortality tonics. In the long history of royal beauty and health fads, few practices illustrate the extremes of ambition and desperation more vividly than the ingestion of gem and metal-infused tonics in imperial China. These concoctions, often prepared for emperors and members of the court, promised not merely beauty or vitality, but immortality itself. To drink a liquid infused with powdered jade, gold, or even mercury was to partake in a ritual that claimed to unite the human body with the eternal cosmos. It was a disturbing blend of alchemy, vanity, and desperation, one that often carried deadly results. The tradition drew heavily from Taoist alchemy, which held that certain substances contained the essence of cosmic balance and could prolong life or even grant eternal youth. Jade, prized for its purity and durability, was believed to embody harmony and strength. Gold, imperishable and radiant, was thought to confer incorruptibility. Mercury, with its shimmering liquid form, was imagined as a bridge between the earthly and celestial realms. Court alchemists, seeking imperial favor, devised tonics that blended these elements into elixirs of supposed immortality. Chinese emperors were particularly vulnerable to the allure of such potions. As rulers who embodied both earthly authority and divine mandate, they faced immense pressure to preserve their vigor. An emperor's health was not merely personal, it was tied to the stability of the dynasty itself. To drink an immortality tonic was to attempt to secure both one's own youth and the empire's longevity. The symbolism was irresistible, even if the results were catastrophic. Medical scholars and some court physicians warned against these practices, noting symptoms of poisoning that ranged from tremors and confusion to madness and sudden death. Records describe emperors who deteriorated after consuming mercury or arsenic-based elixirs, their pursuit of immortality leading to weakness instead of strength. Yet the ritual persisted for centuries, because to reject it was to admit mortality, a truth few emperors could face. What makes this fad especially disturbing is not only the substances involved, but the authority that sustained it. Unlike cosmetics applied privately, these tonics were endorsed by the highest levels of the state. Alchemists and courtiers had powerful incentives to promote their recipes, since imperial favor could mean wealth and security. Failure to provide a convincing elixir, however, could mean disgrace or worse. This dynamic created a dangerous cycle. Emperors demanded immortality, alchemists promised it, and the results were consumed despite known risks. The cultural fascination with these tonics also filtered down to the wider elite. Noble families sought their own versions of gemstone powders and mineral elixirs, convinced that consuming the essence of jade or pearl could improve complexion, calm the spirit, or invigorate the body. Thus, the royal obsession with immortality trickled into beauty rituals across the court. The same powdered pearls that adorned Mughal and European cosmetics found echoes in the tonics of Chinese nobility, a global pattern of consuming treasure for vitality. The tragic irony of gem and metal-infused tonics is that they achieved the opposite of their intent. Instead of conferring eternal life, they often hastened decline. Yet their persistence underscores a recurring theme in royal beauty culture: the conflation of appearance with survival. To look eternal was to rule eternally. For emperors who measured themselves against heaven itself, risking their lives for a chance at agelessness seemed rational, even necessary. From a modern lens, these tonics reveal how power magnifies vulnerability. The more exalted the ruler, the greater the pressure to deny the inevitability of aging. And so emperors, surrounded by wealth and knowledge, turned not to moderation, but to alchemy, poisoning themselves in the name of perfection. But while emperors consumed dangerous tonics to extend life, other royals pursued beauty through indulgence in decadent rituals that seemed almost as wasteful. In both ancient Egypt and Rome, elites immersed themselves in entire baths of donkey milk, convinced that its richness softened skin and preserved youth. This next fad reveals how even luxury itself could become a form of vanity turned disturbing. 22. Donkey milk immersion baths. Long before modern spas and skincare lines, the elites of antiquity sought their own indulgent treatments to preserve youth and beauty. Among the most legendary was the immersion bath in donkey's milk, famously attributed to Cleopatra of Egypt and later imitated by Roman aristocrats. These baths, requiring vast quantities of milk from entire herds of animals, were touted as the secret to soft, supple skin. To bathe in milk was to bathe in luxury itself, but it was also a disturbing display of extravagance, revealing how far rulers would go to maintain appearances. Cleopatra's name has become inseparable from this practice. Ancient writers claimed that she kept hundreds of donkeys to ensure a steady supply of milk for her bathing rituals. Whether the stories were exaggerated or not, they captured the imagination of later generations who associated her allure with the decadent baths. For Cleopatra, cultivating beauty was inseparable from cultivating power. Her political influence depended in part on her ability to embody an almost divine radiance, and the milk bath became a symbol of her control over both nature and image. The Romans too embraced the fashion, though often as a display of wealth more than medical wisdom. Aristocratic women, and sometimes men, soaked in vats of donkey or goat milk, believing it nourished the skin and delayed aging. Physicians of the time debated the benefits, with some acknowledging that lactic acid might soften skin, while others warned about spoilage and the risk of infections. Moralists mocked the practice as excessive, describing nobles lounging in spoiled milk while the poor went hungry. The image of elites soaking in animal produce became a metaphor for decadence itself. The disturbing aspect of donkey milk baths lay in their sheer extravagance. Procuring enough milk required immense resources. Entire herds had to be maintained not for sustenance, but for cosmetic indulgence. Servants labored to collect and heat the milk, and attendants managed the baths to ensure the empress or noblewoman could luxuriate in comfort. The waste was staggering, and critics seized upon it as evidence of moral decline. To spend so much on personal beauty when others starved was seen by some as emblematic of corrupt rule. At the same time, the baths reveal how beauty was framed as both personal and political. For Cleopatra, the milk bath was not only about skin softness, it was about embodying goddess-like qualities that bolstered her authority. For Roman aristocrats, bathing in milk separated them from ordinary citizens, elevating them into a realm of luxury reserved only for the highest ranks. The ritual thus reinforced class divisions, using beauty as a tool of distinction. Modern science does confirm that lactic acid can exfoliate and soften the skin, lending some basis to the ancient claims. Yet the method of achieving this effect through entire baths of milk was unsanitary, excessive, and impractical by any standard. The souring of the milk posed risks, and infections were likely common. What nobles perceived as rejuvenation may well have been temporary softness, followed by irritation or illness. Ultimately, donkey milk baths highlight the intersection of vanity and extravagance in royal beauty culture. They stand as reminders that in many courts, appearances mattered so much that even waste and risk were reframed as virtues. And yet, while donkey milk represented indulgence, other beauty fads veered into harsher territory. In early modern courts, manuals recommended depilatories made from corrosive substances like lime, arsenic, and turpentine. These harsh mixtures promised smooth, hairless skin, but they also left behind burns and scars, a grim contrast to the softness sought in milk baths. 23rd, turpentine and corrosive depilatories. The desire for smooth, hairless skin has been a recurring theme across royal courts and aristocratic cultures. In early modern Europe, where beauty manuals circulated among the nobility, depilatories were presented as essential recipes for refinement. While shaving or plucking could be employed, many women of the elite sought more sophisticated methods. Creams and pastes advertised as scientific solutions to unwanted hair. The ingredients, however, were anything but gentle. Lime, arsenic, and turpentine often formed the base of these depilatories, producing caustic mixtures that promised sleek results while frequently inflicting burns, blisters, and scars. The recipes were often elaborate. Manuals recommended blending quicklime with orpiment, an arsenic-based mineral, and combining it with vinegar or oils. Others advised turpentine, valued for its ability to dissolve, though its harshness on skin was notorious. Applied directly to the face, arms, or legs, these concoctions would chemically burn away hair at the root. To the noble user, the result could seem miraculous: soft, hairless skin that aligned with courtly ideals of femininity. Yet to achieve this effect often meant enduring stinging pain and the risk of permanent damage. Barbers and surgeons of the time were divided. Some recommended caution, warning that caustics could erode not just hair but the skin itself, leaving raw or scarred areas. Others dismissed the risks, insisting that beauty demanded sacrifice. Apothecaries continued to sell such preparations, knowing their clientele valued results above safety. In the glittering courts of France, Spain, and Italy, smooth skin was so closely tied to delicacy and refinement that women were often willing to accept burns as part of the price. Satirists seized upon the absurdity. Caricatures depicted women scorched by their own cosmetics, mocking them for pursuing beauty at the expense of comfort. Moralists warned that vanity was leading nobles to self-destruction, comparing depilatories to poisons disguised as ointments. Yet the ridicule had little effect. As long as court culture prized perfection, dangerous methods retained their allure. Smooth skin was a mark of distinction, a way to separate noble bodies from the rough appearance of peasants whose work left them weathered and unadorned. From a modern standpoint, these depilatories appear shocking, not only for their ingredients, but for their acceptance. They reflect the lengths to which societies will go when appearance is elevated above well-being. Much like lead-based hair dyes or cinnabar rouge, corrosive depilatories illustrate how beauty rituals often created the very damage they claimed to cure, trapping users in cycles of dependence. The disturbing legacy of these recipes lies in their normalization. In their own time, they were not fringe experiments, but mainstream practices circulated in respected beauty books. Their use by queens and noblewomen reinforced the message that to endure pain and risk for beauty was both expected and admirable. That such dangerous mixtures were applied to the skin of Europe's most powerful women underscores the extraordinary pressures of courtly life, where appearance was inseparable from influence. And as alarming as these depilatories were, they were not the only dental or cosmetic rituals that carried hidden dangers. In the same period, aristocrats turned to aggressive methods for whitening their smiles, scouring their teeth with powders made of pumice, coral, or even sulfuric acid. The pursuit of brilliance extended to the mouth, where the price of elegance was often a set of ruined teeth. 24. Tooth powders with pumice and acid. While modern dental care emphasizes preservation, aristocratic practices of the 18th century often did the opposite. In an age before toothbrushes and toothpaste became widespread, nobles sought dazzling white teeth through abrasive and corrosive powders. Recipes preserved in beauty manuals and apothecaries' records describe mixtures of ground pumice, coral, brick dust, or even pearl. To heighten the effect, some powders incorporated acids, vinegar, lemon juice, or diluted sulfuric acid that promised to dissolve stains and brighten enamel. The result was an immediate, striking whiteness, but one achieved at the expense of the teeth themselves. The motivation for such practices was rooted in courtly culture. A gleaming smile was not merely cosmetic, it was a marker of refinement and health. At salons and banquets, where conversation and laughter filled candlelit halls, attractive teeth were as much a social currency as fine clothing. Nobles who smiled with stained or decayed teeth risked ridicule, while those with bright smiles drew admiration. The pressure to maintain this standard was immense, particularly for women, whose beauty was constantly scrutinized. The powders, when first applied, often delivered dramatic results. The abrasives scoured away surface discoloration, while the acids etched enamel to reveal a brighter layer beneath. For a ball or portrait sitting, the effect could be transformative, yet the damage was swift. Repeated use thinned the enamel, exposing the softer dentin underneath. This led to heightened sensitivity, rapid decay, and eventual tooth loss. Dentists of the time, still an emerging profession, warned against these methods, lamenting that aristocrats were effectively sanding their teeth to the quick. Despite these warnings, the fad persisted. Part of the appeal lay in its accessibility. Powders could be prepared at home or purchased from apothecaries. They were marketed as modern and scientific, often endorsed by figures claiming medical authority. The combination of immediate results and fashionable endorsements outweighed concerns about long-term consequences. For nobles living under the constant gaze of peers and rivals, the allure of instant brilliance was irresistible. Satirical writers again found rich material. They mocked courtiers whose pursuit of pearly smiles left them toothless, suggesting that vanity was consuming their very means of expression. Some moralists linked the practice to broader critiques of aristocratic decadence, arguing that nobles were literally grinding themselves away in the name of appearance. Yet such critiques rarely gained traction. Just as with other beauty fads, the social rewards of conformity outweighed the risks. From a modern perspective, these powders highlight how beauty standards often thrive on extremes. Teeth, naturally varying in color and prone to staining with age, were reframed as objects of perfection, to be polished and brightened regardless of the cost. That nobles were willing to erode their enamel with brick dust and acid underscores how deeply status was tied to physical appearance. The disturbing legacy of these tooth powders lies not only in the damage they caused, but in their symbolism. They reveal how courts prized illusion over health, brilliance over strength, Teeth might crumble, but as long as they gleamed for a season, they fulfilled their purpose. And if nobles were willing to sacrifice their teeth for a fleeting smile, they were just as willing to sacrifice their comfort for facial perfection. In the Baroque era, many aristocrats went to bed each night with plaster seroti masks hardening on their faces, convinced that these stiffening setups would freeze their youth in place, even as critics compared them to death masks worn by the living. 25. Seroti and plaster face setups overnight. In the Baroque age, when aristocratic life revolved around appearances, few practices reveal the unsettling side of beauty culture as clearly as the nightly use of plaster masks, known as seroti, to set the face. Noble women, and sometimes men, would go to bed with their faces stiffened under layers of plaster or waxy ointments, convinced that this ritual would preserve youth and freeze their features in a state of elegance. To modernize, the image is eerie, courtiers lying in bed, their faces immobilized in hardened masks, resembling corpses more than sleeping aristocrats. Yet for those who practiced it, this was not absurd but necessary, a nightly investment in the perfection demanded by their society. The logic behind seroti was rooted in the belief that facial muscles could be trained or restrained like cloth or leather. If one immobilized the skin during sleep, it was thought wrinkles could be prevented and youthful firmness preserved. Beauty manuals from the Baroque era advised the application of stiffening plasters or wax-based concoctions before bed, warning that neglecting this discipline would hasten aging. Some recipes even blended herbal extracts or scented oils into the plaster, making the regimen feel luxurious despite its grim appearance. The social pressures that sustained this fad were immense. At the French court of Louis XIV and later Louis XV, appearance was inseparable from influence. Women who failed to embody the ideal of youth risked losing their standing in salons and losing the notice of powerful patrons. The Caroti mask became a silent yet powerful tool of competition, a way to maintain the illusion of eternal youth even as time advanced. In private, it may have been uncomfortable or even suffocating, but in public it translated into smoother faces that secured admiration and envy. Critics did not hold back in their commentary. Satirists compared the wearers of plaster masks to the dead, calling them living statues or walking death masks. Moralists warned that such practices symbolized vanity's triumph over nature, arguing that nobles had become more concerned with appearing lifelike in portraits than with living in truth. Even some physicians cautioned that suffocating the skin with plasters could clog pores, trap sweat, and cause eruptions, the very imperfections the masks were meant to prevent. But as with so many fads, ridicule and warning had little effect on those caught in the relentless cycle of courtly competition. What makes the seroti disturbing is not only the visual image of sleeping in a hardened shell, but the mindset it reveals. To immobilize one's face each night was to deny natural expression and embrace rigidity as beauty. It was a kind of nightly rehearsal for immortality, a refusal to accept the inevitability of change. In a culture obsessed with appearances, the plaster mask was not a burden but a badge of discipline, proof that one was committed to the endless labor of refinement. The practice also left its mark on art and literature. Portraits of the era often idealized sitters with unnaturally smooth mask-like faces, an aesthetic that may have been shaped quite literally by these nightly rituals. Poets and satirists alike used the imagery of masks to critique a society in which beauty had become inseparable from artifice. The seroti thus stands as a symbol of an age when performance extended even into sleep, when nobles transformed rest into another stage for vanity. And while plaster masks may seem grotesque to us today, they were hardly the only cosmetic fad to combine concealment with danger. In the same French court where Caroti was popular, another beauty accessory flourished, tiny adhesive patches called mouches, worn to cover pox scars or blemishes. These patches, though small and seemingly harmless, carried their own unsettling legacy. 26. Beauty patches to hide pox scars. By the 17th and 18th centuries, smallpox had left its mark on European courts, disfiguring nobles and monarchs alike. Survival often came at the price of permanent scars, especially on the face. In a world where smooth, flawless skin was essential to aristocratic identity, courtiers turned to a clever but disturbing solution. Small, shaped patches of black silk or velvet, known as mouches, flies. These were glued directly onto the skin to conceal blemishes, creating both disguise and decoration. What began as a practical cover quickly evolved into a full-fledged fashion, with patches placed not only to hide scars, but also to signal flirtation, wit, or political allegiance. The use of patches flourished at the French court of Louis XV, though it was not confined to France. Across Europe, noble women and some men adopted the fad. A single patch could mask a scar, while multiple patches arranged strategically across the face created a pattern both alluring and symbolic. Beauty manuals of the time even offered guides to placement. A patch near the lip suggested coquetry, one near the eye hinted at passion, and one on the forehead indicated dignity. Courtiers transformed medical concealment into coded language, turning scars into opportunities for intrigue. Yet behind the playfulness lay disturbing realities. Physicians warned that sealing sores beneath adhesive patches could trap infection, leading to festering wounds. Critics mocked nobles who, in their eagerness to appear flawless, worsened their conditions by suffocating their skin. Moralists condemned the fad as deceitful, arguing that patches masked not only blemishes, but also truth. Satirists compared patch-covered faces to starry night skies, filled with dark spots that mocked the pursuit of beauty. The fad also highlighted the deep anxieties surrounding disease and appearance. Smallpox scars were more than cosmetic flaws. They carried the stigma of illness and vulnerability. For nobles, whose power depended on projecting health and vitality, patches became shields against both social judgment and personal insecurity. In salons and at court, a patch-covered face could still command admiration, transforming imperfection into a fashionable game. From a modern perspective, beauty patches reveal the inventive ways in which people adapt to harsh realities. They turned disfigurement into decoration, concealing trauma beneath artifice. Yet their popularity also underscores how unforgiving court culture was. Instead of accepting scars as part of survival, nobles felt compelled to disguise them at any cost. The very survival from smallpox, a triumph in itself, became socially inadequate unless hidden under velvet flies. What makes this fad disturbing is the way it trivialized suffering. Scars that testified to survival were reframed as shameful, to be erased or disguised. Nobles who had endured disease were pressured into hiding their marks, perpetuating an impossible standard of flawlessness. Even as patches became playful tools of fashion, their underlying purpose remained a grim reminder of how appearance dictated acceptance. The story of beauty patches also connects back to a broader pattern in royal beauty culture, the constant negotiation between concealment and revelation. Just as karate masks froze the face into unnatural smoothness, patches converted scars into ornaments, erasing the body's truth in favor of society's demands. And while patches may seem quaint compared to corrosive creams or mercury ointments, they paved the way for yet another fad rooted in concealment and rigidity. In the 18th century, courtiers experimented with egg-white varnishes, shellacking their faces into brittle masks that cracked with every smile. Another reminder of how beauty ideals often hardened into prisons of artifice. 27. Egg-white facial varnish. In the 18th century, European courts were dominated by an obsession with smooth porcelain-like skin. Pallor and flawlessness were synonymous with refinement, and nobles went to extraordinary lengths to maintain this ideal. Among the more curious and unsettling beauty fads of the period was the use of egg whites as a facial varnish. Noble women, and sometimes men, would apply layers of beaten egg whites to their skin, letting it dry into a tight, glossy film that temporarily smoothed lines and gave the appearance of youthful tautness. The result was a face that shone under candlelight like polished porcelain. The science, or at least the perception of science, behind this practice was simple. Egg whites dry to a brittle, translucent layer, pulling the skin tight in the process. This instant firming effect mimicked the youthfulness so prized at court. Manuals from the period recommended applying the albumen varnish before balls or portrait sittings, praising it as a quick and inexpensive way to refresh the face. To nobles constantly under scrutiny, the allure of instant transformation was irresistible. But the effect came at a cost. Once dried, egg-white masks made the skin rigid, restricting movement and expression. Smiling or speaking risked cracking the brittle surface, leaving flakes behind or creating fissures that revealed the artifice. Critics remarked that nobles varnished in egg whites looked more like dolls than people, their expressions frozen into stiff masks. Far from natural youth, the effect often emphasized the unnatural lengths to which courtiers went to maintain appearances. Physicians and satirists alike warned against the practice. Doctors argued that blocking the skin's pores with hardened albumen could cause eruptions or worsen blemishes. Satirical pamphlets mocked women whose faces cracked mid-conversation, comparing them to painted statues or broken porcelain figurines. Yet the ridicule did little to dampen the fad, for the immediate tightening sensation convinced many that the treatment worked. In an age before photography, where portraits and candlelit impressions defined one's reputation, the temporary mask was deemed worth the discomfort. What makes this fad disturbing is not simply its oddity, but its symbolism. By shellacking their faces, nobles literally turned themselves into masks, embracing rigidity as beauty. Natural expression, laughter, conversation, spontaneity was sacrificed in favor of an image. To live behind a cracking varnish was to embody the paradox of courtly life. Appearances mattered more than reality, even if they were brittle and short-lived. From a modern perspective, egg-white varnishes foreshadow modern cosmetic fads that promise instant but temporary results. They reveal how nobles accepted discomfort and fragility as part of beauty, much as they endured corsets or lead-based cosmetics. The varnish was not a cure for aging, but a performance of youth, a ritual that reinforced the relentless demand to project perfection. And while this fad may seem relatively harmless compared to arsenic or mercury, it paved the way for other cleansing rituals that were far more hazardous. In the spas and courts of Europe, sulfur fumigations were embraced as treatments to purify the skin and body, subjecting nobles to clouds of noxious smoke that choked the lungs and irritated the eyes in the name of beauty. 28. Sulfur fumigations. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, European spas were celebrated as places of healing and rejuvenation. Royals and nobles flocked to them for cures that promised to restore vigor, extend life, and preserve beauty. Among the most fashionable and disturbing treatments was the sulfur fumigation bath. In this ritual, courtiers sat in enclosed chambers while sulfur was burned nearby, filling the air with acrid smoke meant to cleanse the body and skin. Physicians of the time claimed the fumes could drive out impurities, treat skin conditions, and balance the humors. To many, it was a cutting-edge therapy. To modern eyes, it was little more than suffocating self-poisoning. The logic stemmed from ancient beliefs about sulfur's purifying qualities. Sulfur was associated with fire and transformation, its pungent smoke thought to drive away disease-causing miasmas. At spas in France, Germany, and Italy, nobles were instructed to sit in sulphurous rooms or over burning pans of the substance, allowing the fumes to envelop their bodies. Some even endured smoke directed at the face, a treatment prescribed for blemishes or dull skin. The idea was that the foul vapors expelled toxins, leaving behind clarity and health. In practice, the sessions were often miserable. Sulfur fumes burned the eyes and throat, causing coughing fits, tearing, and shortness of breath. Patients emerged with reddened eyes, raspy voices, and reeking clothes. Some fainted or vomited, overwhelmed by the acridity. Yet attendants reassured them that these reactions were signs of the treatment's effectiveness, proof that impurities were being expelled. The worse the discomfort, the more nobles believed the fumigation was working. Satirists quickly found material in the absurdity. Pamphlets lampooned spa-goers, choking in clouds of smoke, mocking their willingness to suffer indignity for fleeting beauty. Physicians, too, were divided. While some swore by sulfur fumigations as modern medicine, others noted the damage they caused to lungs and eyes. Reports circulated of patients developing chronic coughs or worsened skin conditions after repeated treatments. Yet the allure of purification, combined with the prestige of fashionable spas, kept the practice alive. The disturbing quality of sulfur fumigations lies in their theatricality. Unlike ointments or creams applied in private, these rituals were public communal acts. Royals and nobles sat together in smoky rooms, choking in unison, convinced they were engaging in a noble pursuit of health. The spectacle reinforced the idea that beauty and vitality required endurance, that suffering was itself a form of discipline. To emerge from the fumes was to demonstrate commitment to refinement, no matter how unhealthy the process. From a modern lens, sulfur fumigations represent the dangers of pseudoscience wrapped in prestige. They highlight how easily health rituals can blur into performance, sustained less by results than by cultural belief. For nobles, the very unpleasantness of the treatment was part of its appeal. If it was painful and difficult, it must be powerful. The legacy of these fumigations is a reminder of how collective culture can normalize harmful practices. What might seem unbearable in isolation becomes acceptable when shared by peers, especially when endorsed by physicians and rulers. And just as nobles endured choking fumes for the promise of purification, others would later endure equally harsh treatments for the sake of slimming. In aristocratic manuals, vinegar and alum-soaked bandages were recommended as waist-shrinking swaddles, touted as miraculous, yet leaving many faint, burned, or scarred. 29. Vinegar and alum. Waist-shrinking swaddles. Among the more peculiar beauty fads to appear in European aristocratic culture was the use of vinegar and alum-soaked bandages, wrapped tightly around the torso in the hope of reducing the waistline. Long before the invention of modern shapewear or surgical procedures, nobles sought ways to alter their silhouettes chemically as well as mechanically. Manuals from the 17th and 18th centuries recommended this practice as a slimming aid, suggesting that acids and astringents would eat away fat or tighten the flesh. Combined with tight lacing, these swaddles promised dramatic reductions in size, but in truth they inflicted burns, fainting spells, and lasting injury. The method was both simple and punishing. Strips of cloth were soaked in vinegar, alum, or other acidic solutions, then bound tightly around the body for hours. The sensation was often described as searing, but beauty guides framed this as a necessary discomfort, claiming the acids purified the body by dissolving excess. Some practitioners even advised sleeping in the swaddles to maximize their effect, despite the obvious risk of suffocation or chemical burns. Physicians of the time voiced their doubts. While alum and vinegar could temporarily constrict or irritate the skin, they did nothing to reduce fat or truly shrink the waist. Instead, they caused inflammation, dizziness, and fainting, effects often mistaken for signs of success. Critics warned that repeated use led to damaged skin, scarring, and internal weakness. Yet the practice persisted, fueled by the social obsession with narrow waists and the illusion of fragility. What makes this fad disturbing is its combination of futility and harm. Unlike corsets, which at least visibly reshaped the body, vinegar swaddles offered little more than pain disguised as progress. Nobles endured burning and fainting not because the results were real, but because fashion demanded evidence of effort. To suffer in the name of beauty was to prove one's refinement, even if the suffering achieved nothing. From today's perspective, vinegar swaddles serve as a cautionary tale about how pseudoscience thrives in environments where appearance is everything. They remind us that harmful practices often survive not because they work, but because they align with cultural ideals. And in the courts of Europe, the slender waist was such a powerful ideal that nobles were willing to endure almost any method to pursue it. Yet the obsession with altering the body did not stop with chemicals or bandages. Some nobles even went so far as to alter their sleep itself, convinced that reclining in bed was dangerous to beauty. Instead, they sat upright through the night, hoping to preserve their features, a fad as impractical as it was unsettling. 30. Sleeping upright to preserve features. From the Bourbons of France to the Habsburgs of Austria, nobles developed elaborate rituals to protect their appearance during sleep. Among the strangest was the belief that lying flat in bed could deform the face, deepen wrinkles, or even invite apoplexy. To guard against these imagined dangers, some aristocrats adopted the practice of sleeping upright, propped on pillows or seated in chairs, their bodies denied rest in the pursuit of beauty. This fad reflected broader anxieties about aging and mortality. Sleep was already viewed with suspicion by some physicians who associated lying flat with congestion of the blood or suffocation. Manuals suggested that posture during sleep influenced both health and appearance, and nobles, ever anxious to maintain refinement, took these warnings seriously. By remaining upright, they believed they could keep their features firm, their complexion smooth, and their bodies protected from sudden death. Accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries describe aristocrats with elaborate sleeping arrangements, special chairs or bolstered beds designed to hold them at an angle through the night. Servants were tasked with adjusting cushions and ensuring that nobles did not slip into more comfortable positions. The effect was often restless nights and chronic fatigue, but the discomfort was justified as a safeguard against aging. Satirists ridiculed the practice mercilessly. Pamphlets mocked nobles for spending their nights perched like statues, too afraid of wrinkles to rest. Moralists warned that such vanity reflected misplaced priorities, valuing appearance above health or even sanity. Yet the ridicule had little effect. To many nobles, the sacrifice was worth it if it preserved the illusion of agelessness at court. The disturbing aspect of this fad lies in its inversion of sleep's purpose. What should have been a source of restoration became another arena for discipline and performance. Even in their most private hours, nobles could not escape the demands of beauty culture. They denied themselves comfort in order to conform to ideals that equated fragility with elegance. Today, the practice appears absurd, but it reflects a recurring theme in royal beauty fads. The willingness to transform every aspect of life, even rest, into a performance of refinement. And while sleeping upright might seem excessive, other fads involved substances far more offensive, as nobles slathered their skin with creams made from rancid fats and animal secretions, convinced they were preserving youth. 31. Cold cream laden with whale and civet bases. Among the luxurious cosmetics of early modern Europe, cold cream held a special place. Marketed as a soothing balm to soften skin and preserve youth, it became a staple in aristocratic beauty routines. Recipes varied, but many relied on bases of whale fat, civet musk, or other animal secretions mixed with rosewater or herbs. These creams were meant to hydrate and perfume, yet in practice they often spoiled quickly, producing rancid odors and spreading bacteria. What began as a symbol of refinement frequently devolved into a literal application of decay. Whale oil, prized for its richness, was shipped from distant oceans to supply the demands of European courts. Civet musk, extracted from the glands of civet cats, was similarly exotic and expensive, lending prestige to any cosmetic that contained it. To the aristocracy, these ingredients symbolized luxury, rarity, and sophistication. A jar of cream infused with such materials was not merely a moisturizer, but a status object, proof of wealth and global reach. Yet perfumers themselves admitted the challenges. Animal fats and secretions turned rancid quickly, especially in warm chambers. Courtiers joked about perfumed rot, a phrase that captured the contradiction of creams meant to beautify but reeking of spoilage. Physicians warned that rancid fats could irritate the skin or spread infection, but their cautions were often ignored. To nobles, the immediate effect of softness and fragrance outweighed the long-term risks. Satirists again found rich material in this fad. Caricatures depicted nobles slathered in foul-smelling creams, mocking them for disguising decay with luxury. Pamphlets suggested that the creams symbolized aristocracy itself, gilded on the outside, rotten within. The metaphor was potent, and yet the practice endured, for no courtier could afford to appear without the soft, scented skin that fashion demanded. The disturbing legacy of cold creams lies in their embrace of corruption. Nobles knowingly applied substances that spoiled, convincing themselves that the richness of the ingredients elevated the practice. In truth, they were rubbing decay into their pores in the name of elegance. It was another example of how beauty culture transformed discomfort, risk, and even disgust into markers of sophistication. And while cold creams symbolized a daily indulgence, another fad turned to medicine itself as fashion. Before the invention of vaccination, some royals made a spectacle of undergoing variolation against smallpox, transforming a dangerous medical procedure into a courtly trend that divided physicians and moralists alike. 32. Variolation as a court-fashion smallpox was one of the most feared diseases of the early modern world, killing millions and leaving countless survivors scarred. In the 18th century, long before Edward Jenner's vaccine, an older method of prevention, variolation, was introduced to European courts. The procedure involved deliberately infecting a healthy person with material taken from a smallpox sore, usually through scratches on the skin or insertion into the nose. The hope was that the patient would suffer only a mild case and thereafter be immune. What began as a medical experiment soon became a fashionable ritual among royals and nobles, who embraced it both as a mark of boldness and as a way to display modernity. In England, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu championed the practice after observing it in the Ottoman Empire. Her advocacy led to variolation being introduced at court, where members of the royal family underwent the procedure. Reports of their survival and immunity spread quickly, transforming what had been a dangerous gamble into a trend. Nobles across Europe began to follow suit, eager to demonstrate their courage and sophistication. Variolation became a fashionable topic at salons, a ritual that set the elite apart from the fearful masses. But the practice was far from safe. Some patients developed severe cases and died, while others spread smallpox to those around them. Physicians were divided. Some hailed variolation as a miracle, while others condemned it as reckless. Clergy, too, debated its morality, questioning whether it was sinful to deliberately introduce disease. Yet the very controversy only added to its allure at court. For nobles accustomed to flaunting their daring, undergoing variolation was both a medical choice and a social performance. What makes variolation disturbing in this context is its transformation from a medical procedure into a fashion statement. Royals and nobles were willing to risk their lives not only for immunity, but for prestige. To be variolated was to declare oneself enlightened, courageous, and modern. Those who refused risked appearing backward or cowardly. The line between health and vanity blurred, with survival itself becoming another tool of social competition. From a modern standpoint, variolation underscores the peril of turning medicine into spectacle. While it did lay the groundwork for vaccination, its adoption as a fad reveals how nobles treated even life and death decisions as part of the performance of refinement. Survival became a badge of sophistication, while tragedy was dismissed as the price of progress. And as disturbing as this practice was, it was not the final chapter in toxic beauty culture. Even after variolation, nobles continued to experiment with substances far more harmful than smallpox inoculation. Renaissance and Georgian beauty guides quietly recommended face bleaching with sublimate, corrosive mercury that promised porcelain skin but delivered ulcers, tremors, and what critics called the painted death. 33. Face bleaching with sublimate, corrosive mercury. Of all the disturbing beauty fads to haunt royal and aristocratic history, face bleaching with sublimate, better known as corrosive mercury, stands out as both alluring and deadly. From the Renaissance through the Georgian era, beauty guides quietly recommended this method to those who sought the pale, flawless skin that defined nobility. Porcelain whiteness was more than fashion. It was a social marker that separated the leisured elite from labourers bronzed by the sun. To achieve this ideal, many nobles turned to cosmetics laced with mercury chloride, a substance capable of bleaching the skin but also of destroying it from within. The process seemed miraculous at first. Applied in lotions, waters or powders, corrosive sublimate could lighten freckles, fade scars, and even out the complexion. A noblewoman appearing at court with a fresh, pale glow embodied the era's aesthetic ideals, and for men too, a clear, pale face was associated with dignity and refinement. The promise of instant transformation made these treatments irresistible, especially in societies where beauty directly affected influence and prospects. Yet the dangers were profound and well known even then. Apothecaries and physicians observed that prolonged use led to skin ulceration, trembling hands, tooth loss, and nerve damage. Some sufferers developed what contemporaries called mercurial palsy, a wasting of strength and stability that revealed itself too late. Critics described the results as painted death, a phrase capturing both the cosmetic illusion and the hidden decay. Despite this, many nobles persisted, trapped by the demands of fashion and the fear of imperfection. The disturbing legacy of face bleaching with sublimate lies in its paradox. It was both a symbol of refinement and a slow poison. Nobles knowingly risked their health for fleeting appearances, convincing themselves that flawless skin justified the cost. It stands as a stark reminder of how beauty culture, when entwined with power and status, can turn even the deadliest substances into coveted treasures.